Take a slow breath. Let your body sink into wherever you are right now. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to go anywhere. All that exists right now is this quiet space and the sound of my voice, and 150 strange, beautiful, haunting facts about one of the most extraordinary worlds ever placed in a video game. Dark Souls. A world of crumbling kingdoms and hollow gods, of firelight and fog, of swords passed between strangers across space and time. Let it wash over you. Let it carry you somewhere between waking and sleep, somewhere the bonfire never goes out, and every death is just the beginning again. Section 1. The Origins of the Flame, Facts 1 through 15. Let's begin at the very beginning. Not in Lordran, not in the Undead Asylum, but in an office, somewhere in Japan, with a man who wasn't supposed to be there at all. Fact 1. Hidetaka Miyazaki, the mind behind the entire Dark Souls universe, didn't start making games until he was 29 years old. Most people who build careers in game design start young, hungry, fresh out of school, loaded with enthusiasm and pixel dreams. Miyazaki took a completely different road. He studied social science at Keio University, one of Japan's most prestigious institutions, and then went to work as an account manager for Oracle Corporation, the American software giant. He did that to help pay for his sister's college tuition. He wasn't thinking about games. He wasn't sketching dungeon maps in the margins of business reports. He was just a quietly literary man with a deep love of books, doing an entirely different job. And then a friend let him borrow a video game. That game was Ico, the 2001 PlayStation adventure about a young boy escaping a castle while protecting a ghostly girl. And it changed everything. Miyazaki finished it and thought, I want to do this. I want to make something that makes people feel this way. He applied to gaming companies in his late 20s and was turned away by nearly all of them. Too old, too inexperienced, no portfolio. But one company said yes. From Software hired him, and the rest is a history that would reshape an entire industry. Fact 2. From Software itself had one of the stranger origin stories in all of gaming. The company was founded in 1986 by a man named Naotoshi Zin, not because of any lifelong passion for games, but because of a motorcycle accident. Zin was in a serious crash and received a substantial insurance payout. Bedridden and with time on his hands, he decided to use that money to start a company. From Software began as a developer of business productivity software, the kind of dry, functional applications that have nothing to do with magic swords or dying over and over again. They didn't make their first video game until 1994, nearly a decade after the company was founded. That first game was King's Field, a slow, dark, atmospheric fantasy RPG for the PlayStation. And while it never became a mainstream hit, it planted the seeds of everything that would eventually grow into Demon Souls and Dark Souls. You could trace a direct line from that first game, made by a company founded on insurance money, to one of the most celebrated game series in history. It's the kind of origin story that sounds made up, but isn't. Fact 3. When Miyazaki joined From Software, he started working on the Armored Core series, a mecha combat franchise that has nothing whatsoever in common with Dark Souls aesthetically. Giant robots, sci-fi settings, fast-paced action. He worked on Armored Core, Last Raven in 2004, joining the project midway through. He wasn't the director, wasn't the visionary, wasn't the celebrated auteur yet. He was just one part of a large team, learning how game development worked. He later directed Armored Core 4 and Armored Core 4 Answer, building his technical skills and his understanding of pacing, world design, and systems. But his heart was somewhere darker, somewhere more mythological, somewhere that smelled of old stone and cold fog. Fact 4. The game that became Demon Souls was considered a failure before it was even finished. The project had been languishing in development, misshapen and directionless, when Miyazaki heard about it and practically ran to take over. His reasoning, which he later described in interviews, is remarkably honest and a little bit beautiful. Because everyone already thought the game was going to fail, he had nothing to lose. If his ideas worked, wonderful. If they didn't, nobody would be surprised. The game was already a disappointment before it launched. So, He threw everything he had at it. He reimagined the structure, the tone, the systems, the way story was told through environments and items rather than cutscenes. He made Demon Souls into something completely unlike anything From Software had done before. And when it launched in 2009, it was received negatively at the Tokyo Game Show, sold poorly at first, and seemed to justify everyone's pessimism. But then, slowly, something happened. People started telling other people, word spread, and a cult was born. Fact 5. Dark Souls itself almost didn't happen. When Miyazaki and From Software wanted to make a spiritual sequel to Demon Souls, they ran into a fundamental problem. Sony owned the Demon Souls intellectual property. That meant they couldn't simply continue the series without Sony's involvement, and Sony's involvement meant platform exclusivity and complicated negotiations. So, rather than fight over the IP, they made a new world entirely. Dark Souls, released in 2011, was their answer. Same DNA, completely different universe. The interconnected world, the bonfire system, the asynchronous multiplayer, the death and retry philosophy, all of it carried over, but the story, the setting, and the characters were entirely fresh. It was a clean break that turned out to be a creative gift, because Dark Souls ended up with its own distinct mythology that was arguably even richer than what had come before. Fact 6. Miyazaki has spoken about a specific memory that helped shape the design of Dark Souls multiplayer. He described being in his car on a snowy hill one night, and the vehicle stalled. He couldn't move. A stranger appeared out of the darkness and helped push the car, and then another stranger appeared and helped, and then another. None of them spoke to each other. None of them exchanged names. They just silently helped him get moving again, and then disappeared back into the night. That quiet, anonymous act of kindness from strangers who asked for nothing became the philosophical foundation for Dark Souls multiplayer systems. The ghostly apparitions of other players you can glimpse moving through the world, the glowing summoning signs on the ground, the messages left in chalk, players helping players without ever truly speaking, without ever truly knowing each other, in a world that is fundamentally lonely and cold. That snowy hill is why those things exist. Fact 7. Miyazaki grew up in a household where video games were not allowed. His family was not wealthy, and games were considered a luxury that simply wasn't available to him. So, instead, he read. He read constantly. He read fantasy novels, mythology, Old English literature, books that were often well beyond his reading level. He would encounter passages he couldn't fully understand, and, rather than skip them, he would fill in the gaps with his own imagination. He created stories to explain the parts he couldn't parse. That childhood habit of constructing meaning from fragments, of finding narrative in gaps and silences, became the engine of how Dark Souls tells its story. Item descriptions as lore, environmental details as history, cryptic NPC dialogue as emotional truth. You are always filling in the gaps, just as young Miyazaki filled them in those borrowed books. Fact 8. The manga Berserk by Kentaro Miura is one of the most direct and openly acknowledged influences on the Dark Souls series. Miyazaki has spoken about his love of Berserk in interviews multiple times. The manga, which began publication in 1989 and follows a lone swordsman named Guts through a bleak, monster-ridden medieval world, shares an enormous amount of visual and thematic DNA with Dark Souls. The massive greatswords, the corrupted knights, the grotesque demons and apostles, the sense of a world in which betrayal and ambition cause almost every tragedy. You can find Berserk's fingerprints all over Dark Souls if you know where to look. And in the DLC Artorias of the Abyss, the tribute is essentially in plain sight. Artorias, a legendary knight corrupted by dark forces, fighting with a shattered arm, surrounded by wolves, is drawn from the same mythological well as Guts wearing the Berserker armor. The wolf imagery, the broken heroism, the way greatness is inseparable from ruin, all of it is Berserk, translated into the language of Lordran. Fact 9. The first Dark Souls was released in September 2011 in Japan and October 2011 internationally. It launched on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 to an industry that was saturated with blockbusters. That same year saw the release of Skyrim, Batman, Arkham City, Portal 2, Uncharted 3, and Modern Warfare 3. Dark Souls was not supposed to compete with those giants. It wasn't supposed to be a mainstream success. The marketing budget was tiny compared to those releases, and Namco Bandai, who published the game in the West, essentially had no idea what to do with it. But the community did something remarkable. They taught each other how to play it. Forums, early YouTube videos, word of mouth between friends. The game spread not through advertising, but through people grabbing each other by the arm and saying, "You have to experience this." Fact 10. Dark Souls 2 was directed by a different team entirely. Miyazaki could not direct both Dark Souls 2 and Bloodborne simultaneously, so he took a supervisory role on the sequel while directing Bloodborne in parallel. Tomohiro Shibuya and Yui Tanimura co-directed Dark Souls 2, and the result was noticeably different in tone, atmosphere, and even basic design principles. The lighting system was less sophisticated, the interconnected world design gave way to something more fragmented, and the famous elevator to the Iron Keep, which placed a volcanic fortress above what appeared to be a windmill and poison tower, became a beloved joke among fans for its geographic impossibility. A developer interview later revealed that the Iron Keep was meant to be understood as situated on a higher volcanic plane, but the design didn't communicate that clearly enough. The gap between intention and execution is a very human thing, and Dark Souls 2's rougher edges made it both fascinating and controversial. Fact 11. Miyazaki returned to full directorial control with Dark Souls 3, which released in Japan in March 2016 and worldwide that April. It was one of the fastest-selling games in Bandai Namco's history at the time, moving over 3 million copies worldwide within its first month, and eventually surpassing 10 million copies sold by 2020. That record was later shattered by Elden Ring, which Miyazaki directed and which sold 12 million copies in its first 2 weeks. But Dark Souls 3 was already proof that what had started as a cult oddity had become a genuine mainstream phenomenon. The series that nobody expected to succeed had somehow become the standard against which an entirely new genre would measure itself. Fact 12. From Software was partially acquired by Tencent in 2022. The Chinese technology conglomerate purchased a 16.25% stake in the company, while Sony Interactive Entertainment acquired 14.09%. The remaining 69.66% remains with Kadokawa Corporation. This distribution of ownership raised questions among fans about creative independence, but Miyazaki has remained president of the company, and there has been no publicly visible shift in the kind of games From Software makes. Miyazaki was promoted to company president in May 2014, following the success of Dark Souls, making him one of the few people in Japan to successfully change careers in his late 20s and rise to leading a major company within 10 years. It's the kind of trajectory that shouldn't statistically be possible, and yet. Fact 13. The first Dark Souls game has an extraordinarily high completion rate compared to most action RPGs. Despite its reputation for punishing difficulty, approximately 42% of players who started the game on PlayStation earned the Platinum Trophy for completing every achievement. That number is, by any standard, staggeringly high for a game that kills you constantly, hides its quest lines, and never tells you where to go. The reason is the community. The same passionate network of players who spread the game by word of mouth also built wikis, filmed tutorial videos, posted strategies on forums, and summoned each other into their games to help beat the hardest bosses. Dark Souls created a community of mutual aid around difficulty, which is perhaps the most unexpectedly wholesome outcome imaginable from a game about despair. Fact 14. Miyazaki's literary influences extend well beyond Berserk. He has cited the fighting fantasy series of Choose Your Own Adventure books by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone as significant inspirations, along with the works of various fantasy and horror novelists. His taste in fiction runs toward the dark and the mythological, toward stories that place enormous weight on the past and treat ruins as sacred. In 2018, he received the Golden Joystick Award for Lifetime Achievement, and in a fitting detail, the award was presented by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone themselves, two of his stated inspirations. That Miyazaki stood up there holding an award given to him by the men whose books he had loved as a child is the kind of full-circle moment that makes you believe in things. Fact 15. In 2023, Time magazine named Miyazaki one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He was only the second game developer to appear on that list, the first being Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario and Zelda, the company that was founded because of a motorcycle accident. The man who wasn't supposed to work in games. The project everyone thought was going to fail. Somehow, all of it led to this. A Japanese game designer standing alongside heads of state and cultural icons as one of the people whose work shaped how the world thought about something. He remains, by all accounts, deeply uncomfortable with any kind of celebrity. He wants to make games. He wants them to speak for themselves. Those are the first 15. If you're still awake, I'd love it if you left a comment below. Tell me your favorite Dark Souls memory, a boss that broke you, an NPC you cried over, and if this is the kind of slow, unhurried journey into lore and history that you enjoy, a subscription means a great deal. It helps more than you might think. Now, settle in. There are 135 more facts waiting in the dark. Section 2. The Architecture of Lordran. Facts 16 through 30. Lordran is not just a setting, it's an argument. It's a statement about what a game world could be, woven together with such deliberate care that scholars of game design still return to it years later to try to understand how it was done. Fact 16. The world of Lordran in the first Dark Souls is almost entirely interconnected without fast travel in the early game. This wasn't an accident or a limitation of the technology. It was a deliberate philosophical choice. Miyazaki wanted players to understand space, to feel the physical relationship between areas, to experience the world as a real geography rather than a menu of loading screens. Firelink Shrine sits at the literal and spiritual center of Lordran, and paths spiral outward from it in multiple directions. The Undead Burg leads to the Undead Parish. The parish connects to the Darkroot Garden. Below, Blighttown squats at the bottom of a long, poisonous descent. And at its base, the entrance to Quelaag's domain leads to the Demon Ruins and eventually to Lost Izalith. Anor Londo floats above everything else, reachable only by a vertical conveyance that feels like ascending into heaven. Every path feeds back on itself. Open a door in one place and find yourself looking back at a familiar landmark from a new angle. Lordran is a puzzle you solve with your feet. Fact 17. The famous shortcut from Blighttown back to the Valley of Drakes is one of the most celebrated moments of environmental revelation in game history. Players who have endured the long, miserable descent through Blighttown's poison swamps and rickety platforms discover, near the area's base, a back door that connects them to an area they could have reached from an entirely different direction much earlier. The first time you push through that door and recognize where you are, with the drake standing there against the familiar gray sky, something clicks into place. The world is real. The world is consistent. It was all there, the whole time, and you were always inside of it. Fact 18. You can actually see Ash Lake from the Tomb of the Giants. These are two areas that most players would never think to connect. The Tomb of the Giants is a pitch-black catacomb deep beneath the earth. Accessible after the catacombs, home to massive skeletal enemies you can barely see. Ash Lake is a secret area at the base of the world, a vast primordial shoreline where the great arch trees rise from pale water and the world still feels ancient and unhurried. To reach it, you descend through a hollow tree in Darkroot Basin. But if you look out from certain points in the Tomb of the Giants, you can glimpse that vast pale expanse far below. The geography is consistent. Lordran is actually built correctly, vertically as well as horizontally, in a way that the game never announces and rewards only the most observant. Fact 19. Anor Londo, the gleaming city of the gods bathed in perpetual golden sunlight, is actually in permanent darkness. The sunlight is an illusion maintained by Gwyndolin, the youngest child of Gwyn, who uses his lunar magic to project the appearance of warmth and divine radiance over a city that has been abandoned by its gods. When you accept Gwyndolin's covenant and then later kill him, the illusion breaks. The light dims to a cold twilight, and Anor Londo reveals itself as the hollow, forsaken place it truly is. The most beautiful location in the game was always a lie. The gods departed long ago, and the light they left behind is nothing more than an old magic running on thin, guttering power. Fact 20. The painted world of Ariamis is one of the most emotionally complex secrets in the entire game. Hidden inside a painting on the upper floor of Anor Londo, accessible only if you brought a specific item from the undead asylum, it is a world created by or for someone who had nowhere else to go. Inside the painting, you encounter beings that the gods of Anor Londo considered dangerous or undesirable, reanimated abominations, crow-like enemies, and at the center of it all, crossbreed Priscilla. Priscilla is a half-dragon, born of a divine parent and a dragon, considered unnatural and unwanted by the gods of Lordran. She was placed inside the painting so the world wouldn't have to deal with her. She doesn't want to fight you. Her opening words are a quiet request to leave. If you attack her, you can kill her. If you don't, you can walk away. And the painted world remains her sanctuary, the only place she was ever allowed to simply exist. Fact 21. Sen's Fortress is widely considered one of the most punishing areas in the game, not because of its enemies, but because of its traps. Giant pendulum blades sweep across narrow corridors. Boulders roll down slopes toward you. Serpent men drop from above. The fortress is a gauntlet of environmental cruelty designed to test everything you've learned about patience and observation. What many players don't initially realize is that the boulders crashing down from above can be redirected. If you find the mechanism that controls the boulder chute and flip a lever, the boulder rolls sideways into a pit instead of down the stairs. And inside that pit you find a merchant named Crestfallen Merchant sitting on a ledge. He sells useful items. The trap is also a riddle, and the riddle has a reward. Fact 22. Blighttown's reputation for poor performance on the original PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions of the game is legendary among longtime fans. The area is a twisting descent into poison and misery, architecturally dense with wooden platforms, rope bridges, and dark, dripping caverns. On the original hardware, it ran at roughly 15 frames per second for many players, turning an already difficult area into something genuinely surreal. The frame rate drop became so notorious that it was practically memorialized as part of the Dark Souls experience. When the remastered edition launched in 2018, fixing the performance issues was one of the primary selling points. The tagline might as well have been, "Blighttown now runs correctly." Fact 23. The Great Hollow and Ash Lake are entirely optional areas that a significant portion of players never find on their first playthrough. The entrance to the Great Hollow is concealed inside a hollow tree in Darkroot Basin. You have to attack the inside of the tree to reveal an illusory wall, then attack again, and then descend through a vertiginous series of branches and crystal cave formations to reach the bottom. Ash Lake, below the Great Hollow, contains two enemies, a treasure chest, and one of the oldest visual ideas in the game, a shoreline where arch trees rise from flat water and the sky is pale and empty. Nothing story-critical happens there. No major boss waits. It's simply one of the most eerily beautiful spaces in the game, existing purely to exist, as if From Software wanted to show you the world before any of the tragedy happened. Fact 24. The Duke's Archives, home of Seath the Scaleless, is built around the visual language of knowledge and imprisonment. The architecture is entirely different from the rest of Anor Londo, dense with bookshelves, spiral staircases, crystal golems standing like frozen scholars, and the eerie glow of Seath's experiments. The first time you arrive, Seath kills you. That is the intended experience. You are captured, placed in a prison cell, and must escape. The game forces death on you as a narrative beat, using the resurrection mechanic as a storytelling device. The archives are a monument to the costs of forbidden knowledge, to what happens when the pursuit of understanding becomes pathological. Seath was a dragon who betrayed his own kind in exchange for immortality, and the Duke's Archives are what his obsession eventually built, a beautiful prison full of terrible secrets. Fact 25. The New Londo ruins contain one of the most haunting environmental stories in the game. The city was flooded deliberately by the four wardens who sealed off the city with their deaths, to contain the Dark Wraiths and the four kings who had been consumed by the abyss. When you first visit, the area is flooded and the enemies are ghosts that cannot be harmed by normal weapons. You have to apply transient curse to your hands to strike them, but if you drain the water, the ruins reveal themselves properly. submerged streets and buildings, the city that was, now silent and half collapsed. Everything you need to do to progress requires understanding what happened here and why, and the area never tells you in plain language. It asks you to look and to draw your own grief-soaked conclusions. Fact 26. The Undead Asylum, the game's opening area, can be revisited. Most players leave it behind and never return. But if you find the peculiar bird's nest near Firelink Shrine and leave a homeward bone in it, the giant crow that carried you away from the asylum at the start will carry you back. The asylum has changed in your absence. A new stray demon has moved into the first courtyard. Oscar, Knight of Astora, the dying knight who gave you the Estus flask and set you free in the opening minutes, has returned as a hollow. His questline is heartbreakingly short. He was the one who rescued you, who sacrificed his last ember of will to give you a chance, and the game's only reward for going back is watching what became of him. A few words, a hollow's eyes, and then he attacks you, and it's over. Fact 27. Dark Souls features 10 covenants, each offering a different way of experiencing the game's multiplayer systems. Some make you a defender, some make you an invader. The Dark Moon Blades exact revenge on players who have been invaded and killed others, tracking down sinners across different worlds. The Path of the Dragon Covenant, reached at Ash Lake, is built around a meditation pose and the aspiration to become a dragon, which is a journey the game hints at but never truly completes. The covenants are not just mechanical systems. Each one is a philosophical stance on the world, a way of being undead, a choice about what you value in an existence that might otherwise feel completely purposeless. Fact 28. There is a primordial serpent hidden beneath the New Londo ruins named Darkstalker Kaathi. You can only meet him under specific conditions. You must not have linked the flame when you drained New Londo, and you must have defeated the Four Kings before speaking with Kingseeker Frampt, the other serpent who sleeps beneath Firelink Shrine. Frampt serves Gwyn's agenda, pushing you toward the linking of the flame to continue the Age of Fire. Kaathi serves a different master and a different philosophy. He represents the Age of Dark, the Age of Humanity, the belief that the cycle of fire should be allowed to end so that something new can begin. The fact that both serpents have been manipulating the cycle for ages, that neither can be fully trusted, that both versions of the ending carry costs no one clearly explains. All of this sits at the heart of what makes Dark Souls philosophically interesting. There is no clean answer. There never was. Fact 29. The elevator that connects Firelink Shrine to the Undead Parish is, geometrically speaking, one of the most cleverly designed shortcuts in gaming. It exists as a vertical slice through Lordran that allows you to move from the central hub to one of the game's earliest areas quickly once you've proven yourself capable of reaching it. But the detail that makes it magical is where it comes from in the lore, the connection between the Firelink bonfire, tended by a tongueless firekeeper, and the great bell of the undead church above. Bonfires and bells, fire and sound. The game is always threading meaning through its architecture, and the elevator is one of its quietest, most functional poems. Fact 30. The city of Izalith, now called Lost Izalith, was once a magnificent capital. The Witch of Izalith and her daughters were among the founding powers of the world, who rose up with Gwyn to defeat the everlasting dragons. They were proud, capable, and powerful beyond nearly all other beings. But the witch attempted to replicate the first flame, to create a new source of fire from her own soul, and it failed catastrophically. The bed of chaos erupted from the attempt, a writhing mass of fire and life that killed the witch and corrupted her daughters into chaos witches. Lost Izalith, in the game's present, is a ruined landscape of orange light and crumbling stone, a place where the greatest ambition in the world burned itself to the ground. It is the oldest tragedy in Dark Souls. It happened before the player's story began, and all that's left is the wreckage. Bonus to Section 2. The painting, the abyss, and the architecture of meaning. Before we leave this section about the world's physical design, consider for a moment what Lordran communicates structurally that most worlds never attempt. The geography of Lordran is a moral map. Ascending means approaching divinity, approaching the old power, approaching the grand illusions the gods have constructed. The higher you go, the more beautiful the architecture, and the more thoroughly everything that beauty contains has been arranged to obscure an ugly truth. Anor Londo is radiant. Anor Londo is hollow. The sun that falls across those golden buttresses is a lie maintained by a lonely, half-forgotten son of a dead king. And descending means truth. Blighttown is ugly, poisonous, structurally unstable. It is also honest in ways Anor Londo isn't. The things that fester at the bottom of the world aren't hiding what they are. They're simply what happens when resources are scarce and systems have broken down. The moral architecture of Lordran rewards descending with honesty and ascending with beauty that cannot be trusted, which is perhaps the most precise thing the game says about the relationship between power and integrity. The Lost Izalith, the deepest place you visit in any meaningful lore sense, is the most ancient and the most ruined. It is not full of new monsters. It is full of old ones, creatures who were something else entirely before the Bed of Chaos remade them. The demonic creatures of Lost Izalith, the Chaos Bugs, the Centipede enemies, the Chaos Eaters, these were once living things that the failed attempt to replicate the First Flame transformed into nightmare. The deeper you go in Lordran, the older the wound you're looking at. And at the very bottom, further down even than Lost Izalith, is Ash Lake, where nothing is wounded because nothing is recent. It is simply old. It is the world before the wound. The arched trees rising from still water, and the sky pale and silent, as if waiting for something to begin. Section 3, Steel and Sorcery. Facts 31 through 45. The weapons and mechanics of Dark Souls are not just systems, they are stories. Every sword, every staff, every ring carries history in its item description, and the mechanical design choices encode philosophy as surely as any cutscene. Fact 31. Dark Souls features a poise system, which determines how much damage a character can absorb before being staggered out of an animation. At launch, equipping heavier armor would grant more poise, allowing players to tank through attacks that would otherwise interrupt their swings. This created the beloved heavy armor meta, knights in full plate slowly walking toward enemies and trading blows without flinching. In Dark Souls 3, poise was technically still present in the game's data, but appeared to be completely non-functional for much of the game's lifetime, leading to widespread confusion and a deluge of patch notes analysis. Community researcher Lance McDonald eventually discovered that poise in Dark Souls 3 was indeed present, but only activated during the specific hyper-armor frames of weapon attacks, not while standing still. The entire community spent weeks arguing about whether poise worked until someone went into the code. Fact 32. Mimics are one of the most psychologically devious enemies in all of Dark Souls. They appear as large, ornate treasure chests, positioned among real treasure chests, and there is no visual identifier in the base game that clearly marks which chests are genuine and which are predators waiting to bite you. The community developed methods of detection. Throw an undead hunter charm at a chest and see if it flinches, or listen for the subtle sound of breathing. Some players still open mimics by accident on their 20th playthrough. The anxiety of approaching any large chest in the Souls games, the tiny hesitation before pressing the button, is a kind of conditioned stress response that the games have trained into their players, a chest that breathes. It is one of the simplest and most effective horror concepts in the series. Fact 33. The Drake Sword, obtainable very early in the game by shooting the tail of the Hellkite Drake on the bridge above the undead Berg, was for years considered both a lifesaver for new players and a crutch that could ultimately harm their progression. The sword's base damage is extremely high relative to where you are in the game when you get it, making it enormously effective in the early and mid-game. But because its scaling is non-existent, it stops growing with your character. Players who relied on it too heavily arrived at Sen's Fortress and Anor Londo to find their beloved sword had become inadequate. It taught an important lesson about the limitations of stagnation, about the need to keep growing. Not a metaphor, a tutorial. The Drake Sword was always a lesson wearing a sword's clothes. Fact 34. The Zweihander, one of the largest greatswords in the game, became famous in the community for a particular reason. It's obtainable in the starting area, purchasable from a merchant in the undead Berg for a modest number of souls, and with enough strength investment, it can be one of the most powerful weapons in the entire game. It weighs an enormous amount, requires significant strength to wield with two hands, and its moveset is slow, but the power per hit is devastating. For new players discovering that a game they thought required finesse could be approached with enormous, slow, laughably oversized swords, the Zweihander was a revelation. It said, "You can play this however you want, heavy or light, fast or slow. There is a path for everyone through Lordran." Fact 35. The Moonlight Greatsword, a sword made of pure crystallized moonlight, appears in some form in almost every From Software game ever made. It is in Demon Souls. It is in the first Dark Souls. It is in Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3. It is in Bloodborne, where it appears as Ludwig's holy blade and obsesses the beast Ludwig even in his monstrous form. It is in Elden Ring. It has appeared in Armored Core. It is the single most persistent weapon in the studio's entire catalog, a recurring symbol that transcends every world they build. Its lore varies by game, but the visual identity is always the same. A massive blade that glows with a cold blue-white light, crystalline and impossibly beautiful. It is From Software's signature weapon, their recurring dream, their own bonfire. Fact 36. The Estus Flask, the healing item that is given to players at the very start of the game, is explicitly tied in the lore to the power of bonfires. The flask is filled by resting at a bonfire, and its healing energy is described as the essence of fire itself. Every time you drink from it, you are consuming a fragment of the first flame. The Estus Flask is not just a health item. It is a communion. You are literally drinking fire to survive. And when you kindle a bonfire, investing the humanity you've gathered to increase its power, you are contributing your own gathered energy to the fire, adding your collected experiences to the communal flame. The resource management of Dark Souls is steeped in the same mythological framework as its story. Nothing is arbitrary. Fact 37. The occult upgrade path for weapons is one of the most lore-saturated mechanical choices in the game. Occult weapons deal bonus damage to divine creatures, specifically gods and their servants. In Anor Londo, you find a hidden room containing Havel's armor and multiple occult weapons. The existence of these weapons in the City of the Gods suggests that someone, at some point, was preparing to use them against the gods themselves. The lore theorists point to Havel the Rock, imprisoned in the undead Burg, as someone who turned against Gwyn, possibly because Gwyn granted Seath the Scaleless, their old enemy, a position of power. Weapons designed to kill gods, hidden in the god's own city. Another Dark Souls secret that isn't so much buried as it is placed in plain sight for anyone willing to look. Fact 38. The Hornet Ring, one of the more subtle rings in the game, dramatically increases the damage of critical strikes from backstabs and riposts. It was originally crafted for Lord's Blade Tyrion, one of Gwyn's 4 knights and the only female member of that legendary group. Tyrion is an assassin, a dancer-like warrior of incredible precision, and the Hornet Ring reflects her philosophy. She doesn't win through endurance, but through perfectly placed lethality. When you meet her in the DLC Artorias of the Abyss, she is kneeling over the grave of Artorias with a golden sunlight medal in hand, mourning him. She loved him, and the item in her possession, the item she's leaving as an offering, was specifically made to honor his sacrifice. A ring that kills precisely, a woman kneeling in the rain, one of the quietest love stories the game never declares. Fact 39. The dragon form, obtainable through the Fourth of the Dragon Covenant, allows players to grow stone scales over their body and breathe fire. It is achieved through a process of meditation at specific dragon-shaped effigies scattered across the world, and by acquiring dragon scales through combat or covenant mechanics. Very few players engage with this system deeply enough to see its endgame, but it exists. A human being that has pursued the ancient power of the everlasting dragons, who were the first rulers of the world, and gradually become something in between. The Dragon Covenant and its transformation system represent one of Dark Souls' hidden philosophical threads. Before the gods, before the fire, the dragons were all that existed. To become a dragon is to reach backward past the whole of human history. Fact 40. The curse mechanic in Dark Souls is one of the cruelest systems in the game. Basilisks, the large frog-like enemies with enormous false eyes, exhale a purple mist that accumulates a curse status. When fully cursed, Your maximum health is halved permanently until you are cured by a specific item or by a specific NPC. You can be cursed multiple times, halving your health repeatedly down to almost nothing. The remedy is expensive and not always available. The first time a new player discovers basilisks in the depths is usually a formative trauma. The eyes on their body are fake. The real eyes are tiny, buried beneath the false ones. They are a creature literally designed to be misread, to draw your attention to a lie while the real danger builds invisibly. Fact 41. Pyromancy in Dark Souls has no intelligence or faith scaling requirements. It is entirely governed by the upgrade level of your pyromancy flame. This makes it the most accessible form of magic in the game. Any build, any class, any character can become a highly effective pyromancer without sacrificing any character stats. This was presumably intentional as a design choice to give players a low-barrier path into magic, but it also created the famous pyromancer meta in PvP for the game's earlier life, where players in light armor with maximally upgraded pyromancy flames could deal enormous damage to anyone within range. The fireball that anyone can throw, requiring nothing but the willingness to upgrade a small leather glove. Democracy of Destruction. Fact 42. The soul level system, which governs matchmaking in the original Dark Souls, creates what fans call invasion windows. Different soul levels can connect with different ranges of other soul levels for cooperative and hostile play. This mathematical range system created fascinating social dynamics. Some players would deliberately stop leveling at certain soul levels to remain in a specific matchmaking bracket, either to continue helping newer players cooperatively or to optimize for PvP invasions against similarly experienced opponents. The soul level became not just a measure of character power, but a social position, a chosen identity within the community. A player at soul level 120 is making a statement about what they value. Fact 43. There is a weapon in Dark Souls 2 called the Santier's Spear, which, if you break it, cannot be repaired. Normally, breaking a weapon means it needs to be repaired at a blacksmith. But this specific spear, once broken, becomes an entirely different and arguably better weapon, an unbreakable spear that deals multiple damage types. The breakage is the intended upgrade path. You have to break it to unlock it. It is a weapon that only reveals its true nature through apparent destruction, which is either a very clever mechanical choice or a very Dark Souls way of thinking about improvement. Fact 44. The Painting Guardian armor set, worn by the enemies who protect the painting in Anor Londo, is described in its item description as worn by those who have dedicated their lives to protecting and caring for crossbreed Priscilla in the painted world. They are loyal servants of a being who was exiled, guardians of a painting containing someone nobody was supposed to want. They are dressed in white and move in near silence, and they will defend their ward to the death. Everything you need to know about who Priscilla was to the people who loved her, and how completely that love was ignored by the gods who put her away, is in the item description of the clothes worn by the people who kept her company. Fact 45. Dark Souls features a mechanic called humanity, which serves both as a resource for kindling bonfires and restoring your human form, and as a stat that affects item discovery and certain damage resistances. In lore terms, humanity is described as a kind of dark mass connected to the dark soul, the primordial dark power carried by the furtive pygmy who appears in the game's opening cinematic. Human beings are, at their core, small fragments of an ancient darkness. The more humanity you have, the more fully human you are. When you go hollow, you lose your humanity and your human form. The entire mechanic of losing your humanity upon death and having to retrieve it in bloodstained form is a physical representation of what it feels like to lose your sense of self. You go out into the world, and if it breaks you, you become a little less yourself, until you find your way back to what you dropped. Section 4. The Lords and Their Lies. Facts 46 through 60. Every god in Dark Souls is failing. Every divine figure is either hollow, corrupted, hiding, or long since gone. The Age of Fire is ending because it has been held too long past its natural conclusion, and the tragedy of the game's entire cosmology is that the most powerful beings in the world spent their long lives refusing to accept what was inevitable. Fact 46. Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, the final boss of the first Dark Souls, fought alongside 3 others to defeat the everlasting dragons in the ancient past. Before the Age of Fire, the world was ruled by dragons, beings of immutable stone scales who were effectively immortal. Gwyn, the Witch of Izalith, and Gravelord Nito used the powers of their lord's souls to strip the dragons of their scales, expose them to fire and disease and darkness, and drive them to extinction. One dragon, Seath the Scaleless, betrayed his own kind in exchange for the secrets of immortality. The fact that the Age of the Gods began with an act of genocide against the natural rulers of the world is the kind of foundational moral ambiguity that Dark Souls builds everything upon. The gods are not benevolent. They are the survivors of a brutal revolution who have been calling themselves gods ever since. Fact 47. Gwyn sent his firstborn son, a warrior of incredible power, to join the humans who fought the dragons and to help ensure their victory. This son, known in Dark Souls 3 references as the Champion of Ash and in item descriptions as simply Gwyn's firstborn, was stripped of his godhood and erased from the historical record when he sided with the humans against Gwyn's edicts. His name is never spoken in the first game. His statues in Anor Londo have been defaced, their faces chiseled away. He was written out of history so completely that players didn't know who he was for years. It wasn't until Dark Souls 3 strongly implied that Gwyn's firstborn and Solaire of Astora might share a connection, which spawned one of the most beloved and controversial fan theories in the entire series. Fact 48. Solaire of Astora's questline in the first Dark Souls is, depending on how you play, either one of the most uplifting or one of the most heartbreaking experiences in the series. Solaire is a warrior of the sun, cheerful and broad-shouldered, who travels to Lordran on a personal pilgrimage to find what he calls his own sun, a light he can call truly his own. He is a summonable ally in multiple boss fights, one of the few consistently helpful presences in a world otherwise full of betrayal. But if you follow his questline to its natural conclusion without intervention, he travels to Lost Izalith, encounters a parasite called the Sunlight Maggot, becomes infected with it, and goes completely mad. You find him in the corridor beyond, hollow-eyed and violent, wearing the parasite on his head, calling it his son. To save him, you must kill the specific chaos bug that would have infected him before it gets the chance, which requires donating 30 humanity to a hidden covenant to open a specific shortcut. It requires knowledge, it requires preparation, it requires caring enough to do the work. And if you don't know, he goes mad anyway, and you have to kill him, and the sun poem at the end of the game plays over a much colder sky. Fact 49. Gwyn's final boss theme is not a battle anthem. It is a solo piano piece, melancholic and waltz-like, measured and almost hesitant. For a game whose boss themes are almost uniformly operatic, full orchestral explosions of tension, Gwyn's theme is startlingly intimate. Composer Motoi Sakuraba wrote a piece that plays in 3/4 time, a meter associated with waltzes, with dance, with continuous circular motion. This is not coincidental. Gwyn is a man, or a being, who has been trying to keep time itself from moving forward. The Age of Fire should have ended. He refused. He walked into the kiln of the first flame and burned himself into nothing to extend an era that was already over. The waltz meter, the dance that never ends, the music that keeps turning on its axis. It's the sound of someone desperately refusing to stop. Fact 50. Gravelord Nito, one of the 4 lords whose souls you must claim, is literally the first being of death. In the game's creation mythology, death did not exist before the fire brought disparity. Nito arose with the flame and became death itself, ruling over the dead and commanding the power of mortality. His arena, the Tomb of the Nito, is a vast underground cavern filled with skeletons and the enormous, shambling body of Nito himself, a figure entirely composed of fused human skeletons wrapped in a tattered shroud. He is ancient beyond all reckoning. He rarely moves, and when you fight him, it is genuinely one of the stranger boss encounters in the game. You are fighting death, in a tomb, surrounded by the dead, in the deepest part of the earth. He is not aggressive in the way most bosses are. He simply is, and you are an intrusion into the territory of the inevitable. Fact 51. The Witch of Izalith and her daughters created the Chaos Flame through a failed attempt to replicate the first flame. But one daughter, Quelana, escaped the catastrophe. You can find her as an NPC in Blighttown, a pyromancy teacher who is the source of some of the game's most powerful fire magic. She watched her mother become the bed of chaos, watched her sisters become the daughters of chaos, creatures twisted into spider-human hybrids and bound to the failed flame. She survived because she ran, and she carries that survival with her as a grief she cannot express, only wait. She asks you to free her family from their eternal imprisonment by defeating the bed of chaos. When you do, she thanks you and disappears, presumably finally able to leave Blighttown, a place she has been haunting for an age beyond counting. Fact 52. Seath the Scaleless is the only dragon in Dark Souls who lacks the stone scales that made the everlasting dragons immortal. He was born without them, making him both unique and fundamentally vulnerable, mortal in a species of immortals. His decision to betray the dragons to Gwyn was not just ambition, but survival. He helped destroy his own people to gain the Duke's archives and the research facilities to search for a substitute immortality. He eventually achieved something like immortality through the creation of the primordial crystal, a unique item that served as his anchor to life. You cannot kill him permanently in his arena unless you first destroy the crystal. Seath's entire story is about a being defined by what he lacks, who builds an empire of cruelty around the attempt to compensate for his own incompleteness. He is sympathetic and monstrous, and both at once. Fact 53. The four kings of New Londo were once Gwyn's most trusted human leaders. He granted them fragments of his own lordly soul in recognition of their service and loyalty. They were meant to be stewards of the human city of New Londo, governing it with wisdom and power, but a primordial serpent named Darkstalker Kaathi found them and convinced them to seek the Dark Soul's power, to look into the abyss. They became corrupted, lost in darkness. Bardigness, their minds and forms dissolving. They became the four kings. The horror of their story is that they were not evil kings brought low by hubris. They were good men, given incomprehensible power, and then approached by something patient, whispering, and very old. They were a gift destroyed by a greater gift. Fact 54. Gwyndolin, the last remaining deity in Anor Londo by the time of the game's events, was the youngest child of Gwyn and was born male. But because his powers were aligned with the moon rather than the sun, and because Gwyn associated the moon with femininity and thought this made his son's power unsuitable for a male heir, Gwyndolin was raised as a girl. This information is communicated not through cutscene or dialogue, but through item descriptions and careful observation of the character design. Gwyndolin wears robes and wields lunar magic, and is surrounded by serpentine extensions from the waist down, evoking a different kind of divinity altogether. The detail is quiet and precise, and what it says about Gwyn, a god so invested in controlling the nature and presentation of his own legacy that he determined the gender expression of his own child, is not flattering. Fact 55. Dark Souls 3's final boss, the Soul of Cinder, is a composite being made from the accumulated essence of everyone who has ever linked the flame throughout history. Every chosen undead, every unkindled, every person who ever walked into the kiln and burned. They are all in there, layered inside a single figure. The Soul of Cinder cycles through different fighting styles during its first phase. A tank, a sorcerer, a pyromancer, a dex build. It is literally demonstrating every way a player might have played the game, because it contains every player who ever finished it. And in its second phase, it draws on Gwyn's specific power and Gwyn's specific theme plays. The final boss of the final Dark Souls is a monument to everyone who ever played. You are fighting yourself, slightly differently arranged. Fact 56. The Ringed City, the final DLC for Dark Souls 3, takes place at the literal end of the world, the very edge of the Age of Fire, as it collapses. Here, the Pygmies, the descendants of the furtive pygmy who found the Dark Soul in the beginning, have been given a city by Gwyn. He calls it a gift. It is a prison. He encircled their city with a great wall of architecture and stone, and gave them Gwyn's youngest daughter, Filianor, as a token of his eventual return. He was never going to return. The Ringed City is a beautiful, enormous lie, a settlement built to confine people who were considered dangerous because of what they carried in their blood. kept pacified with promises and the presence of a sleeping goddess who, when woken, dissolves the illusion of the present and reveals the ash-covered ruin of the world's end. Every deity in these games is running some form of a con. Fact 57. The Pygmies and their relationship to humanity in the Dark Souls cosmology is one of the most fascinating threads across all three games. The furtive pygmy, who found the Dark Soul in the first flame, is described as so easily forgotten in the game's opening narration. This forgetting is deliberate. The gods consistently suppress, imprison, or ignore humanity's true power because they are frightened of it. Humanity is dark. Darkness is the natural state of the world before the fire and after it. The fear driving every divine decision in Dark Souls is, at its core, the fear of the dark, the fear of what humans actually are and what the world actually wants to become. Fact 58, Lothric, from Dark Souls 3, is one of the more psychologically complex characters in the series' history, primarily because he chose not to link the flame. He was born specifically to be a Lord of Cinder, bred and prepared for the role, surrounded by prophecies and expectations from birth. He studied with Oolacile and was tutored in sorcery and fate. He looked into what linking the flame would mean, what it would cost, what it was perpetuating, and he said no. He retreated to the top of his castle and refused. His twin Lorien, physically broken and mute, followed him there and stayed with him, the loyal, damaged mirror to Lothric's defiant intellectual withdrawal. The boss fight against them requires you to kill Lorien, watch Lothric revive him, kill Lorien again, and then in the final moments have Lothric possess Lorien's dying body to fight you himself. A man who refused to sacrifice himself, sacrificed through his brother. The cycle consumes everyone eventually. Fact 59. Pontiff Sulivan, one of Dark Souls 3's most visually striking bosses, was originally planned to be the game's final boss rather than the Soul of Cinder. Data mining and early development files uncovered by researcher Lance MacDonald suggest that the Pontiff was positioned in the untended graves and was meant to be the last encounter of the game, in a third version of the Firelink Shrine set during neither day nor night. The final version of the game moved him to Oolacile and replaced him with the Soul of Cinder. This would have been a fundamentally different statement about what the series was about. A man who reached too far, rather than an accumulation of everyone who had ever tried and failed and tried again. Fact 60. The Profaned Flame, which plays a central role in the backstory of Dark Souls 3's Oolacile chapter, was an unending fire that could not be extinguished, even by water. It burned everything it touched and kept burning. The Pontiff Sulivan came from the Painted World and found the profaned capital where this fire blazed. He corrupted it, harnessed it, and used it to empower his Outrider knights by giving them Oolacile blades infused with its cold flame. The contradiction of a cold flame, a fire that burns cold, is one of those small Dark Souls details that rewards you for turning it over in your mind. A fire without warmth, a power without comfort, an energy that destroys without sustaining. The profane flame is the opposite of the bonfire. It burns, but it never keeps you safe. Interlude. The cycle and what it costs. Between the facts about gods and endings, let's pause on the structure of what Dark Souls is asking of you. Every NPC you encounter in Lordran is, to varying degrees, losing. They are losing their minds, their bodies, their purpose, their sense of self. The crestfallen warrior is losing the will to care. Solaire is losing himself to something radiant and terrible. Siegmeyer is losing what he thought he understood about his own capability. Big Hat Logan is losing himself to knowledge. Even Gwyn, the most powerful being in the game, has already lost everything and is just the hollow repetition of a moment that happened long ago. Dark Souls is about what losing looks like from the inside. It doesn't editorialize about this. It doesn't tell you that these people have failed. It places you among them and lets you watch and make of it what you will, and then it kills you too, and you get back up and you try again. Which is, come to think of it, the only sensible response to being surrounded by people in various stages of losing. You keep going, not because you're sure it will work, but because staying still is already a form of hollow. The gods of Lordran are not evil in any cartoonish way. They are simply beings who had enormous power and used it to make the world livable for themselves, which is what almost every powerful entity does. and in doing so, made it much less livable for everyone else. Gwyn was genuinely heroic in the Age of Dragons. He won a war that needed winning. He built something real. And then he spent the next several thousand years destroying it by degrees, trying to preserve a moment that couldn't be preserved, afraid of what would come next. The tragedy of Gwyn is the tragedy of anyone who mistakes their greatest achievement for their identity and then spends the rest of their existence trying to keep that moment alive past the point where it naturally would have ended. Section 5. Souls Without Rest. Facts 61 through 75. The characters of Dark Souls are not heroes and villains. They are people in various stages of dissolution, trying to hold on to something in a world that is actively working to erase them. Fact 61. Siegmeyer of Katarina, the Onion Knight, is one of the most beloved NPCs in the entire series. He wears a rounded helmet and round-shouldered armor that genuinely makes him look like an onion, and he is an enormously jolly man in a completely unjolly world. He keeps getting himself stuck. He is found outside Sen's fortress, unable to get past the gate. He is found inside Anor Londo, confused by Silver Knights. He is found in Blight Town, poisoned and sleeping. He is found in Lost Izalith, staring at a pit of Chaos Eaters, with the cheerful confidence of a man who has dramatically overestimated his own capabilities. If you help him at every stage without doing too much, he eventually finds his own quiet, melancholic resolution at Ash Lake. Siegmeyer is the embodiment of a certain kind of person, brave, foolish, warm, perpetually in over his head, and radiating a joy that the world never quite manages to extinguish. Fact 62. Patches is a recurring character across nearly every From Software game, and has appeared in some form in Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, and even Armored Core 6. He is always a rogue, always untrustworthy, always apologetic after the fact. In Dark Souls, you find him in the Tomb of the Giants, and if you tell him you're a cleric, he kicks you into a pit. He then pretends to feel bad about it if you escape, and is entirely willing to forgive himself and sell you things, which is the most Patches thing imaginable. He dislikes clerics and priests as a category, which gives him a kind of ideological consistency. He is not just randomly cruel, he has a specific grudge. He also frequently expresses something like guilt, a quality that makes him endearing despite himself. Patches is the character who knows he's in a dark fantasy world and has simply made peace with being the con man rather than the hero. Fact 63. Artorias the Abyss Walker fights the player with only one functional arm. His left arm, his dominant arm, was shattered in his battle against Manus in the Abyss when he used his great shield to create a protective barrier around his companion Sif. He wields his enormous greatsword in his right hand throughout the entire boss fight. This detail is communicated only through item descriptions and environmental lore. The game never pauses to explain it, but once you know it, the entire fight recontextualizes itself. Artorias, already corrupted by the Abyss, still fighting with a broken arm, still pushing everything he has left against you, and he's still one of the hardest bosses in the game. He has removed dialogue lines, unused audio, where he appears to have briefly gained lucidity after his defeat, saying, "There you are," to Sif, before the darkness took hold completely. Fact 64. Lord's Blade. Ciaran is the only female member of Gwyn's 4 knights, and the one who mourns Artorias most openly. She is an assassin, built for precise, lethal work, and she carries twin golden blades. If you find her in the DLC after defeating Artorias, she asks you for his soul. You can give it to her and receive her armor set, or you can deny her and fight her. She is one of the few NPCs in the series who explicitly and unmistakably grieves. She places a sunlight medal on the grave. She says she will dance on his grave the way she would dance in combat, as a tribute to someone she clearly loved. The 4 knights of Gwyn are each tragic in their own way, but Ciaran's tragedy is the most immediately human. She is just a person standing at the grave of someone she lost, trying to find a gesture adequate to the size of the grief. Fact 65. Big Hat Logan's descent into madness is one of the slower character tragedies in the game, stretched across multiple encounters. You first find him imprisoned in a cage in Sen's fortress. You free him, and he becomes a sorcery merchant at Firelink Shrine. Then he travels to Anor Londo, deeper into the Duke's archives where Seath's forbidden knowledge lives. Then deeper still. Eventually you find him in the crystal caves, hollow, wearing only tattered robes, casting crystalline sorceries at you. He became obsessed with Seath's research, with the idea that a dragon who had no scales had found a way to achieve immortality through knowledge. He chased that understanding so deeply that it consumed everything else. His final item drop is the Tin Crystallization Catalyst, a staff that increases the power of sorceries while cutting off access to any other spells. It's beautiful and limiting, a perfect mechanical metaphor for what obsession does. Fact 66. Havel the Rock is found in a tower in the Undead Burg, locked in a cell, wearing what appears to be armor carved from solid stone. He hits extremely hard and has enormous poise. He is one of the first truly dangerous optional encounters in the game. His lore, pieced together from item descriptions, suggests that he was a bishop and warrior who served Gwyn loyally, hated dragons and Seath in particular, and eventually turned against the gods after Seath was granted the Duke's archives and the dukedom. He may have been imprisoned by Gwyn himself, possibly framed in a manufactured rebellion, facilitated by Seath to remove a dangerous enemy. In Dark Souls 3, there is a hollowed knight wearing Havel's stone armor near Archdragon Peak, the area tied to the remaining dragon power, which suggests Havel's obsession with dragons and his opposition to them ultimately led him somewhere profoundly strange. Fact 67. Hawkeye Goff, one of Gwyn's 4 knights and the largest of them, was a member of the Dragonslayer Greatarchers who helped end the Age of Dragons. He appears in the Artorias of the Abyss DLC as a blind giant living in a small workshop, whittling arrowheads from wood. He was blinded at some point, possibly deliberately, because his sight would have made him too dangerous and too independent. Despite his blindness, he has enough skill to shoot a calamite, a flying dragon, out of the sky when you ask him to. He does it with a single wooden arrow and without being able to see. Goff has a kind of quiet dignity that makes him one of the more internally complete characters in the game, a great warrior who has made peace with his reduction in circumstance, finding meaning in small craft while still capable of the extraordinary when called upon. Fact 68. Lothric of Carim is one of the game's most deliberately loathsome NPCs, and understanding his questline requires that you accept that some people in this world are simply not interested in being better. You find him in a cage in Undead Parish and have the option to free him. If you do, he gives you a gift and later murders Anastasia, the firekeeper at Firelink Shrine, stealing her soul and extinguishing the bonfire there. He does this because he is devoted to the goddess Fina and her love, and his logic, such as it is, reflects a kind of theological devotion so absolute it has become indistinguishable from madness. He invades your world in Anor Londo. You can hunt him down, kill him, and recover Anastasia's soul to restore her. There is no redemption arc for Lothric. He knows what he did. He would do it again. He is not a tragic figure. He is just a person who made himself into a weapon in service of something beautiful and let it make him terrible. Fact 69. Anastasia of Astora is the firekeeper who tends the bonfire at Firelink Shrine. She is tongueless and cannot speak, though she communicates through gesture. She is a being of rare and quiet grace in a world full of noise and violence, and her existence is an act of dedication. She maintains the bonfire so that others can rest and recover, pouring herself into the flame on behalf of strangers. When Lothric murders her and steals her soul, the fire at Firelink goes out. Firelink, the hub of the entire world, the safe place in the center of everything, suddenly feels cold and empty and wrong. You can restore her, but it requires hunting Lothric down and killing him, retrieving her stolen soul and placing it back with her cold body. She revives. The bonfire rekindles, and she says nothing because she never could, but kneels there in the warmth as if that is answer enough. Fact 70. The crestfallen warrior at Firelink Shrine is the first real NPC you encounter in the game. He is sitting by the bonfire in an attitude of absolute defeat. His advice is accurate, but delivered with the tone of someone who has long since stopped caring whether you take it. He knows the layout of the world. He knows what you're supposed to do. He just doesn't see any point in doing it anymore. As you progress through the game, he goes hollow. He leaves Firelink. You find him in New Londo ruins, hostile, attacking you on sight. He has given up completely. The crestfallen warrior is not a warning about dark souls. He is a warning about what happens when you carry knowledge without hope, when you understand the world's cruelty so completely that you can't find a reason to keep moving through it. Fact 71. The male undead merchant in the Undead Burg, a cheerful if slightly unhinged vendor, sells the resident's key that lets you access the lower Undead Burg. He also sells a whip, is the only source of certain items early in the game, and hums to himself contentedly while presumably sitting in a ruined building full of hostile undead. His female counterpart in the depths sells various consumables and is slightly more reserved. Together they represent the small, stubborn commercial life that continues even at the end of the world. People selling things, people buying things, the practical necessities of survival, persisting even in Lordran, even in the architecture of apocalypse. Fact 72. Dusk of Oolacile is a princess from the ancient kingdom of Oolacile who was kidnapped by the abyss creature Manus. You rescue her from a golden crystal golem in the main game, and if you speak with her in a specific location, she gives you access to the Oolacile Ivory Catalyst and a set of spells tied to her homeland. She is the entry point into the DLC, trapped and confused, speaking of her home in ways that suggest she doesn't fully understand how much time has passed or how far the abyss spread. She is a small figure from a vast tragedy, a fragment of evidence that a whole world existed before the abyss consumed it, politely offering you magic and asking nothing in return beyond the courtesy of being spoken to. Fact 73. Kingseeker Frampt, the coiling primordial serpent who awakens at Firelink Shrine when you ring both bells of awakening, is one of the most plausible-sounding liars in the game. He presents himself as a servant of Gwyn, a being placed to guide the chosen undead toward the proper destiny, linking the flame and sustaining the age of fire. He feeds items into his mouth and spits out souls. He is helpful in a very specific direction and becomes deeply unhappy with you if you make choices that deviate from his preferred outcome. Frampt will sink back into the earth and refuse to help if you side with Kyathi or jump into the abyss before defeating Seath. He is not a neutral guide. He has a preferred outcome, and he will quietly disappear when you stop being useful to it. Fact 74. The Dark Moon Covenant and its covenant system creates a kind of divine justice network. When players who have sinned by killing too many NPCs or invading and killing other players under certain conditions accumulate sin, members of the Dark Moon Blades can be automatically summoned into their world as invaders. This is not a human system. It is described in the lore as the divine judgment of Gwendolyn's moon god authority. Blue phantoms, sent to avenge the dead, hunting sinners across the breadth of Lordran. The entire system creates a loop where cruelty is answered by cosmic consequence, and the cosmos in question is a lonely boy god in an empty city, trying to maintain order in a world that has already decided to fall apart. Fact 75. Petrus of Thorolund has one of the more quietly villainous storylines in the game. He arrives at Firelink as an apparent member of the Way of White Covenant, accompanying Rhea of Thorolund on her pilgrimage. He is the first to tell you about the catacombs, giving you information that sends you deeper into danger. When Rhea and her guards are captured in the Tomb of the Giants, he abandons her, claiming he lost her. He is lying. He waited for her to die so he would inherit her ivory talisman and holy knowledges, and when you save her instead, he becomes hostile. He will eventually murder her in the Grand Archives if you don't intervene. Petrus is not monstrous. He is a small person in a big situation who made a series of choices driven by cowardice and personal ambition, and who has long since told himself a story in which those choices were necessary. Dark Souls is full of people like Petrus. The horror isn't always the monster. Section 6, The Beasts Without and Within. Facts 76 through 90, Dark Souls enemies are not obstacles. They are former people, former beings, former glories, caught in states of ruin and kept there by the logic of the world they inhabit. Fact 76. The Asylum Demon, the first boss of Dark Souls, can be defeated in two fundamentally different ways. If you fight him head-on the first time you encounter him, it is a difficult fight for an unprepared new player. But there is a plunging attack available if you drop down from a ledge above the arena, dealing massive damage and starting the fight from a position of advantage. This is the game's first lesson. Situations that seem impossible might just be situations you're approaching from the wrong angle. The Asylum Demon also reappears as a standard enemy later in the game, in the Return to the Asylum, scaled appropriately but no longer a boss. The thing that nearly killed you at the start is just another obstacle by the end. That arc, from impossible to manageable, is the compressed version of the whole game. Fact 77. The gargoyle fight at the top of the Undead Parish is the game's first proper encounter with the double boss mechanic. You fight one gargoyle until it reaches roughly half health, at which point a second one drops from the sky. This moment, witnessed for the first time, produces a very specific kind of despair in players who thought they were close to winning. From Software would return to this trick repeatedly across the series, sometimes bringing in a third boss, sometimes making the reinforcements harder than the original. The lesson embedded in the gargoyle fight is not that the game is cruel, though it is, but that you cannot assume you understand the full scope of a challenge until it's completely over. Fact 78. Ornstein and Smo may be the most famous boss fight in the entire series, and certainly the one that has generated the most internet discussion, expletives, and genuine cultural moments. Dragon Slayer Ornstein, tall and lightning empowered, and Executioner Smuff, massive and hammer-wielding, fight together in the grandest chamber in Anor Londo. Neither of them can be simply ignored in favor of the other, since both pursue the player actively. If you kill Ornstein first, Smoke absorbs his power and gains lightning. If you kill Smoke first, Ornstein grows to enormous size and becomes empowered. Either way, the second phase is harder than anything before it. The fight has a rhythm, a dance, that takes most players multiple attempts to find. The fact that you can summon Solaire of Astora for this fight, making it 2 against 2, is one of the game's quietest acts of mercy. Fact 79. Sif, the Great Grey Wolf, is frequently cited as the most emotionally affecting boss fight in the first Dark Souls. When Sif's health reaches a low enough threshold, the animation changes. The wolf begins to limp. The giant, two-handed movements of a fully healthy Sif are replaced by slower, struggling attacks from a creature that is clearly in pain. The game slows down. The music doesn't change, but the fight takes on a completely different emotional register. You have to finish it. Sif is not an optional boss. The Covenant of Artorias ring that Sif guards is required to traverse the abyss and reach the Four Kings. So, you stand there, in this wide graveyard, next to Artorias' grave, while a loyal wolf limps toward you with a sword that is too big for its jaws, and you do what the game requires. And it is absolutely terrible in the most precise possible way. Fact 80. If you play through the Artorias of the Abyss DLC and find young Sif in the Chasm of the Abyss, the fight against the adult Sif later in the main game changes. Having saved Sif in the past, Sif recognizes you when you arrive in the graveyard. In the altered cutscene, the wolf approaches, almost touches you, then pulls back with a howl and picks up Artorias' sword with a sound of grief rather than aggression. Sif knows you. Sif remembers you saved her, and she has to fight you anyway because the sword must be protected, because Artorias' grave must be kept, because the oath demands it even when the oath costs everything. It might be the single most devastatingly communicated moment of loyalty and tragedy in any game ever made, and it is entirely optional. You only see it if you played the DLC and made the specific choice to save the younger wolf in the past. Fact 81. The Bed of Chaos, the boss representing the failed attempt to create a new First Flame, is almost universally considered the worst boss in the game from a design standpoint. It is a massive root and fire entity that kills you instantly if you fall off platforms that crumble beneath your feet, rewards progress incrementally by destroying parts of it in sequence, and has a specific section where you jump across a gap to hit a small glowing core while the entire floor dissolves. Many players consider this fight the one time the Dark Souls philosophy, in which difficulty is fair and teaches you something, genuinely breaks down. The difficulty here comes not from a challenging but learnable encounter, but from a floor that falls away in a way that kills you before you can react. The Bed of Chaos is evidence that even extraordinary games contain a design that simply didn't come together, and the honesty of that imperfection is almost charming. Fact 82. The four kings of New Londo, fought in the flooded abyss after draining the ruins, are one of the few bosses in Dark Souls where a common recommended strategy is to wear very light armor for fast rolling, or to go the opposite direction entirely and equip the absolute heaviest armor you own for maximum poise and absorption. They also have an unusual mechanic. If you take too long defeating each king, a new one spawns before the previous one is dead, creating a potential situation where you are overwhelmed by multiple enemies at once. The time pressure rewards aggression. Dark Souls often teaches you to be patient. The four kings teach you to be fast when the situation demands it, to know when patience becomes a trap. Fact 83. Manus, father of the Abyss, was not always a monster. He was originally a human being, a primitive man from Oolacile, the earliest human civilization. He was buried in a location called the Chasm of the Abyss, and when the scholars of Oolacile, guided by a primordial serpent, dug up his grave and revived him, the humanity inside him ran out of control. His soul, his dark humanity, overwhelmed everything else, and mutated him into something enormous and elemental. He went mad, and his madness grew the abyss outward until it consumed Oolacile. In Dark Souls 3, the fragments of his shattered soul appear as the 5 Lords of Cinder whose power you must reclaim. The Dark Soul didn't die with Manus. It scattered and was inherited by others, persisting across ages. Manus is the origin point of a trauma that stretches across all 3 games. Fact 84. The Ceaseless Discharge is a boss in Lost Izalith that can be defeated via an exploit most players stumble into accidentally. If you grab an armor set from the altar at the back of the boss area before triggering the fight, the Ceaseless Discharge attacks with a single arm slam that, if you run back to the fog door and stay near it, exposes its arm long enough for you to deal a devastating riposte. You can essentially walk in, grab loot, run back, and kill a boss of significant size by repeatedly punishing its single overextended attack. It feels like cheating. It is not cheating. It is the game giving you a specific environmental challenge and allowing you to solve it in an unorthodox way. Or it is a boss encounter that was designed around its intended placement and breaks down slightly when approached differently. Both things are probably true at once. Fact 85. The painted world of Ariamis contains an enemy called the Engorged Zombie, a pale bloated figure that crawls across floors and explodes when attacked. It also contains phalanx, a formation of blob-like creatures that create a spear-bristling barrier when grouped together. Neither enemy type appears anywhere else in the base game, which contributes to the painted world's feeling of absolute isolation, not just geographically removed from Lordran, but biologically, as if its interior follows different rules. The world inside the painting is not a copy of anything outside it. It is its own place with its own creatures, its own weather, its own moral atmosphere. It snows. It is always snowing in Ariamis. Fact 86. Stone Guardians appear in Anor Londo and are some of the more surprising enemies in the city for new players. They are slow and seem initially dormant, positioned like decorative statues. They are not decorative statues. The game places them in corridors and on platforms with patient cruelty, waiting for you to walk past and triggering their animation the moment you turn your back. The specific anxiety they generate, the knowledge that any large statue might be about to move, follows you around Anor Londo. Every statue becomes a possible guardian. Every quiet corner becomes a potential ambush. Dark Souls trains you to distrust stillness. Nothing is ever just standing there. Fact 87. Crystal Hollows and Crystal Knights in the Duke's Archives emit a status called Curse Buildup through their breath attacks. This is the same curse mechanic as basilisks, which halves your maximum health. In the Archives, surrounded by the crystalline remnants of Seath's experiments, encountering curse as a mechanical threat deepens the environmental storytelling. Seath's work does not just kill. It transforms, it corrupts, it reduces. His domain is a place where your capacity to survive is systematically diminished just by being present within it. The Archives are not just difficult. They are an argument about what knowledge costs. Fact 88. Silver Knights and Black Knights are distinct enemy categories with distinct lore significance. Black Knights are the remnants of Gwyn's elite royal guard, who accompanied him into the kiln of the first flame. When Gwyn linked the flame, the heat of it burned away their flesh and left them as hollow armored shells, wandering Lordran on pointless patrol. Silver Knights stayed behind in Anor Londo and continued their duties even after the gods abandoned the city. There are no living gods left to protect. The Silver Knights guard empty rooms and vacant thrones, loyalty without object, duty without purpose, haunting in their dedication, more human somehow than most of the things with faces. Fact 89. The stone dragon at Ash Lake is a non-hostile enemy that will not attack unless you strike it first, and if you kill it, it simply drops scales. It is one of the last remaining everlasting dragons, the ancient beings who ruled the world before the age of gods. It just sits there, looking out over the pale water, utterly motionless, surviving into an age that has entirely forgotten what it represented. It cannot link the fire or affect the outcome of anything. It is just the last of an old world, persisting by habit or instinct, or the kind of stubborn biological endurance that has no name. If you join the path of the Dragon Covenant by meditating before it, it gives you nothing but the posture, a gesture, a shared stillness. The everlasting dragons were immune to nearly everything. They just sat. They just persisted. And now there is one left at the bottom of the world. Fact 90. Gwendolyn's boss fight begins with what appears to be an infinite corridor in Anor Londo. You walk toward the distant glowing figure, and it keeps moving away from you. The corridor stretches impossibly. It is an illusion, of course. Gwendolyn is pulling the space of the arena around himself to maintain distance, using his power over light and perception. The fight is a chase. He fires lunar sorceries at you, teleports, and keeps the corridor between you, always feeling just a little too long. It is one of the most architecturally unusual boss arenas in the game, and one that communicates its boss's nature, a being of illusions, a maintainer of false realities, a god whose power is fundamentally about controlling what people perceive through its own geometry. Extended reflection. The enemy as former person. Every enemy in Dark Souls exists in a state of ruin. The Hollow Soldiers aren't a generic army of fantasy minions. They were once living people who went hollow over time, losing their sense of self to the Dark Sign's curse. The knights in their rusting armor were once guards of the undead burg. Keeping order before order became an abstract concept in a city that had stopped functioning. The demonic creatures in Quelaag's domain are the daughters of the Witch of Izalith, transformed by the Bed of Chaos. The crystal golems in the Duke's archives were once living beings turned into stone by Seath's experiments, their humanity encased in something beautiful and cold. When you kill an enemy in Dark Souls, you are not defeating an obstacle. You are ending something that was, at some point, something else. The weight of that is present in the animations, in the sounds they make, in the way they die. It doesn't ask you to feel guilty, but it creates the space for the guilt to exist, which is its own kind of honesty. The bosses in particular are almost uniformly beings who deserved better than the fight you're having with them. Sif deserves to keep guarding the grave. Artorias deserved to be saved before the abyss consumed him. Nito exists because death exists and has to be tended by something. And what he tends is not cruelty, but inevitability. Even the Bed of Chaos, the worst fight in the game by common consent, is the remnant of a mother who tried something impossible and failed, and whose daughters have been caring for the impossibility she left behind for longer than anyone should have to care for anything. You fight through them because the game requires it, and because Lordran's story moves in one direction, but the game never pretends that moving forward was free. Section 7. The Depths of the Dungeons. Facts 91 through 105. Every game in the Dark Souls trilogy hides things. Cut content, data-mined secrets, community discoveries made years after launch. The world rewards obsession. Fact 91. Dark Souls has an unused area that was intended to be accessible but was cut before release. A more complete version of the Oolacile township that was simplified for the final game. Data from the original game's files contains geometry and assets for rooms and pathways that don't exist in the shipped product. The Artorias of the Abyss's DLC added a great deal of content to the world's history, but even it contains evidence of ideas that were trimmed and adjusted during development. The gap between what games are and what they almost were, is a kind of phantom architecture, present in every released game, and knowable only through careful excavation. Fact 92. Dark Souls 3 originally ended with Pontiff Sulyvahn as the final boss, set in a different version of the Untended Graves, as mentioned earlier. But the files also contained evidence of a planned day and night cycle system that was abandoned before release. Different lighting conditions, different enemy behaviors tied to time of day, an entirely different relationship between the game's environmental moods and the player's progression through them. The day and night cycle would have made Lothric Castle and other areas feel more dynamic and living. That it was cut suggests either scope limitations or a decision that the fixed lighting served the atmosphere better. Dark Souls 3 is consistently gorgeous in the way its light falls. Perhaps it's for the best. Fact 93. Dark Souls 2 had a dramatically different aesthetic and design in its early promotional material compared to the final game. The pre-release trailers showed a much darker, more atmospheric look, with shadows that obscured enemies and environments in ways the final game's engine didn't replicate. There were promises of advanced lighting and geometry that proved to be showcasing a higher-end build than what shipped on base PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. The community's reaction to this discrepancy was one of the more significant moments of disappointment in the game's reception. The development team later acknowledged the difference, explaining that the team responsible for the promotional build and the team making the actual game were working at different levels of technical ambition. A painful but honest admission. Fact 94. Patches the Hyena has appeared under various names across different From Software games, but is always recognizable by his personality. Roguish, self-serving, moderately apologetic, and ultimately more interesting than his initial presentation suggests. In Dark Souls 3, he returns to find another friend in Greyrot the Thief. Their dynamic, two rogues with a genuine if limited affection for each other, is one of the game's more unexpected emotional notes. Greyrot is sent on increasingly dangerous scavenging missions, and Patches can be recruited to help ensure his survival. Whether this succeeds depends on specific conditions. Greyrot may die, Patches may feel bad about it. The friendship between a thief and a con man in a dying world is quietly one of the most real relationships in any From Software game. Fact 95. The Firekeeper in Dark Souls 3 has a secondary function beyond healing and leveling. If you give her the eyes of a Firekeeper, she gains the ability to see a different ending, a world without fire. The eyes are described as the eyes of a dead Firekeeper, an organ capable of seeing beyond the current age. With them, the Firekeeper can offer you the possibility of ending the cycle entirely, of letting the fire fade into true darkness so that a new age can emerge. This ending was hidden behind a specific item found in a secret location and changes the final cutscene dramatically. It represents the game acknowledging that the Age of Dark is not the worst possible outcome. Sometimes things need to be allowed to end. Fact 96. In the first Dark Souls, there is a crow named Snuggly in the Undead Asylum who accepts items placed in her nest and sends back different items in exchange. The items she wants and the items she gives are not explained. You leave something. You come back. Something else is there. The system is entirely unexplained in-game, discovered through experimentation and community sharing. Snuggly's trade list is one of the most charming secrets in the game because it rewards pure curiosity. What does the crow want? What will the crow give? There is no quest marker. There is no dialogue. There is just a nest and the faint suggestion that something is paying attention. Fact 97. The Xanthaus set, a set of yellow robes worn by a character class called Xanthaus King Jeremiah, is one of the more absurd-looking armor sets in the game, featuring an enormous bright yellow hat. It can be obtained from an invader in the Painted World, and is almost entirely a cosmetic choice, offering no particular gameplay advantages. Dark Souls allows you to look completely ridiculous if you want to. The Xanthaus set exists as proof that the game's otherwise solemn atmosphere coexists perfectly with the ability to wear a hat the size and color of a sunflower into the hardest boss fights in the world. The community has embraced this fully, and it represents one of the quiet ways the games express affection for their players. Fact 98. The dark sign, the mark of the undead that prevents death, appears on the protagonist's character but is never visibly examined in the first game. In Dark Souls 3, it's shown on the wrist of untended characters and is described more explicitly. But in the first game, the dark sign is present as an absolute constraint. You cannot truly die because of it. You just lose your humanity and your souls and your form. The dark sign is Gwyn's doing, imposed on the pygmy humans to prevent the natural return to darkness. He made humanity unable to fully die, condemning them to a cycle of degradation and revival rather than allowing the natural arc of life and death. The curse of the undead is not some external affliction. It is a system designed by a god to keep certain people from completing their own story on their own terms. Fact 99. Data mining of the original Dark Souls files revealed dialogue lines for Artorias that were recorded but never used in the final game. There are lines where he seems briefly lucid, speaking coherently before the abyss closes in again. One line is believed to be addressed to Sif, "There you are," as if catching a last glimpse of his companion before consciousness fades. The developers removed this dialogue, presumably feeling that the silent, corruption-heavy presentation of the fight was more powerful than explicit communication. They may have been right. But the existence of the cut lines means that somewhere, in the game that almost shipped, Artorias said goodbye. Fact 100. The Calamity Ring is one of the most genuinely dangerous items in Dark Souls. It doubles all damage dealt to the player. It has no defensive bonus, no stat increase, nothing useful. It exists solely to make your life twice as hard. It can be obtained through a covenant mechanic, specifically as a reward for betraying certain covenant vows. The ring is, in essence, a punishment you can keep wearing, a self-imposed difficulty modifier. The game's designers made a ring whose only property is suffering, as if to say, some players will want this. Some players will wear this ring through the entire game and feel they have earned something real. They are correct. Fact 101. Dark Souls 2 introduced bonfire ascetics, a consumable item that makes a specific area harder, as if you were in a new playthrough cycle. Drop one into a bonfire, and the enemies nearby respawn, become stronger, and the boss of that area, if already defeated, returns in its powered-up NG+ form. This allowed players to farm specific powerful enemies or fight harder versions of bosses for exclusive rewards without starting the entire game over. It also meant that players who didn't understand the system could accidentally make parts of their game permanently and significantly harder. The bonfire ascetic is a beautifully designed object, a key to more challenge, a risk you hold in your hands, a choice that can only go in one direction. Fact 102. The Aged Feather in Dark Souls 2 is an infinitely reusable item that sends you back to the last bonfire, similar to a homeward bone, but it was added through DLC and requires completing specific content to obtain. Once you have it, you will never need another homeward bone again. It has no obvious lore significance. It's just a feather. Old, dusty, apparently magical. Its value is purely practical, and it exists almost entirely to reward players who engage with the DLC content deeply enough to find it. A small kindness, tucked in the margin of the expansion, for the players who looked. Fact 103. In Dark Souls 3, the Sword of Avowal, found deep in the Oolacile dungeon, can be used to finish Henri of Astora's questline in a way that unlocks a secret ending variation. The questline involves Henri pursuing their own quest to kill Aldrich, facing tragedy along the way, and eventually arriving at an altar where, depending on your choices, you can either help them or use their soul to strengthen the Lord of Hollow's ending. The Sword of Avowal is used in a ceremony that is not explicitly described in any item description or NPC dialogue. It simply waits there, in a small room, for players who found the questline and followed it all the way to its most obscure conclusion. A sword that asks you to pay attention. Another exit for the maze you didn't know you were in. Fact 104. The consumed king Osiros, a boss in Dark Souls 3 found below the Grand Archives, was once the king of Lothric and father of Lorien and Lothric. His transformation into a scaled, dragon-adjacent monstrosity came from studying Seath's research, from trying to apply the Moonlight Greatsword's crystalline power to his own bloodline. He was also searching for his youngest child, Oolacile, a child who may never have fully existed, or who Oolacile may have accidentally killed in his madness. During the boss fight, Oolacile, He cradles what appears to be an invisible infant, talking to it, protecting it. He is a mad, grief-stricken parent whose tragedy is the specific insanity of a parent who may have destroyed the very thing he was trying to protect. It's one of the series' more quietly devastating images. Fact 105. When Dark Souls was ported to PC via the Prepare to Die edition in 2012, the community immediately began modifying it. A fan-created patch called DS Fix by Modder Durante became famous for unlocking the resolution from the game's locked 1024 by 720 pixels to whatever your monitor was capable of, dramatically improving the visual quality. The official port was widely criticized for its technical state, being more of a direct translation from console with minimal PC-specific improvements. DS Fix essentially fixed what the publisher hadn't, and its existence became something of a community legend and a commentary on what passionate fans can achieve. Years later, the Dark Souls Remastered Edition in 2018 finally gave the game proper PC support. But Durante's patch remains a piece of history. Section 8. The Sound of the Dying World. Facts 106 through 120. Before we continue, settle in a little deeper. Take a moment to feel the weight of wherever you're lying. Let your breathing slow. The facts keep coming, soft and unhurried, and none of them have anywhere to be tonight. Fact 106. Composer Motoi Sakuraba wrote the entire Dark Souls soundtrack and is known primarily for his work on the Tales and Star Ocean series, both of which skew toward energetic, progressive, rock-influenced RPG music. Dark Souls required something entirely different, slower, more choral, more cinematic. Sakuraba made the shift, and the result was one of gaming's most discussed soundtracks. His orchestral language for Dark Souls draws on church choir music, gothic choral arrangements, and the kind of heavy, tolling brass and strings associated with tragedy and ritual. It sounds like something heard through stone walls, like music the building itself is making. Fact 107. Gwyn's theme is in 3/4 time, a waltz. Every other major boss theme in the game is in common time, or some approximation of march or battle rhythm. Gwyn alone dances. The waltz is circular, continuous, always returning to its first beat, and Gwyn's entire tragedy is his refusal to allow anything to end. He linked the flame to keep the Age of Fire from concluding. He sent the dark sign to prevent humans from truly dying. He is a being dancing in place, refusing to let the music stop. The solo piano performance of his theme, in an otherwise orchestral soundtrack, strips away the grandeur and leaves you with something intimate and plaintive. An old man alone at the piano, playing the same piece over and over, because the piece ending means everything ending. Fact 108. The absence of music in most of Lordran is itself a design choice. Unlike most action RPGs, which provide ambient musical scores for their exploration areas, Dark Souls' overworld is mostly silent or inhabited only by ambient environmental sound. Wind, water, fire, distant footsteps, the sound of your own breathing. Music appears at bonfires, where the Firelink Shrine theme plays its quietly sustained note, and during boss encounters. This means that every time boss music starts, you immediately understand something has changed. The silence is safety. The music is danger. Your nervous system learns this association after a few hours and never fully unlearns it. The audio design uses absence as a language. Fact 109. The Firelink Shrine theme is one of the most beloved pieces in the Dark Souls score, not because of its complexity, but because of what it represents experientially. It is associated with rest, with safety, with the specific relief of arriving somewhere familiar after a long ordeal. The theme is simple and sustained, more texture than melody, a warm drone that settles over you like the heat of the bonfire. Fans have reported that hearing it outside of the game, in arrangements or concerts, produces an almost physical relaxation response. The brain has been trained to associate that particular combination of tones with being safe. That's not just good game design, that's sound writing itself into memory. Fact 110. Dark Souls 3 employed multiple composers for its soundtrack. Motoi Sakuraba, Yuka Kitamura, Tsukasa Saito, and Nobuyoshi Suzuki. The multi-composer approach created a more varied sonic palette, but also a less unified aesthetic than the first game. Yuka Kitamura in particular received significant praise for her work, including the themes for the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, the Soul of Cinder, and several DLC bosses. Her style tends toward denser harmonic structures and a more modern orchestral approach than Sakuraba's sometimes austere arrangements. The Soul of Cinder theme ends with a direct quotation of Gwyn's theme woven into the orchestral fabric, a deliberate act of musical memory, the accumulated players of the series finally echoing the beginning. Fact 111. The ending credits of the first Dark Souls feature a vocal piece called Nameless Song, performed by Emmy Evans, who also sang for the Nier series. It is ethereal, quiet, and not in any existing language. Evans invented the phonetics to fit the melodic line. It is music in a language that doesn't exist for a world that is ending. It plays over simple static images of the game's most significant characters: Gwyndolin, Frampt, the Kiln, and it is achingly beautiful in the way of things that don't need to be fully understood to be felt. The game ends without fully explaining itself, and the song that closes it refuses to be translated. Factin 112. Ornstein and Smurf's battle music is a masterpiece of escalating tension. It begins with a choir-driven urgency that feels ceremonial and ancient, then shifts during the second phase to something darker and more desperate. The music for the powered-up Smo or Smo-empowered Ornstein is the same piece in a different emotional register, the same ceremony, but now the ceremony is going wrong. The transition in the music tracks the shift in the fight's stakes, which is something only possible when the composer understands what the game is asking from the player at every moment. Fact 113. The music for Seath the Great Grey Wolf is one of the quieter, more sorrowful boss themes in the series. There are no booming climaxes, no triumphant brass. The piece is sustained and aching, with strings that feel like something held under pressure. The music doesn't build to release. It just endures, the way the fight itself endures, past the point of comfort and into something that just needs to be finished. It is music in the key of duty, of things done because they must be done, and not because they feel right. Fact 114. Dark Souls 3's Dancer of the Boreal Valley has one of the most unusual movement sound combinations in the series. Her theme is sweeping and orchestral, with a grace that reflects her design, a tall, shawled figure dancing through her attacks with an almost balletic quality. The specific combination of her visual movement, her long trailing cloth, her flickering twin blades, and the music that accompanies her creates an encounter that feels more like performance than combat. She is a cursed human who became a knight who became a boss, and the music plays as if mourning the beauty in something that has been turned toward terrible purposes. Fact 115. The Painted World of Ariandel, the first DLC for Dark Souls 3, features a boss encounter in a burning, ruined building against Frida, Sister Frida, and Father Ariandel. The fight has 3 phases and escalates from a relatively contained solo encounter to a giant paint-covered monster to the 2 of them fighting together. The music across the 3 phases changes dramatically with each transition, moving from something restrained to something overwhelmingly operatic. Sister Frida's theme, in particular, has a quiet sadness beneath the urgency. She was trying to keep the painted world frozen, static, safe, and everything you do to her throughout the fight is an act of forcing the world to change against someone's deeply held wish that it wouldn't. Fact 116. The ambient sound design in Anor Londo communicates the city's truth before the lore reveals it. The wind is wrong. It sounds empty in a way that beautiful cities do not sound empty. There are echoes where there should be warmth. The sounds of inhabitants, life, movement, commerce, all absent, replaced by the hollow sound of wind through enormous golden corridors. It's the sound of a stage set, of architecture that exists to be looked at, but not to be lived in. The sound designers built the city's lie into the audio, so that players who felt something was off but couldn't name it were already hearing the truth. Fact 117. The sound of hollowing, the specific audio cue that accompanies an NPC going hollow in certain quest lines, is one of the most quietly horrifying sounds in the series. It's a subtle shift in a voice, a quality of distance entering speech that wasn't there before. There's no dramatic transformation sound, no monster roar, just a voice becoming somehow less present, as if the person speaking is already moving away from themselves, from somewhere you can no longer follow. The horror of hollowing is that it isn't loud. Fact 118. The ringtones and notification sounds used at From Software's offices, according to scattered reports, are sounds from the games themselves. The "You Died" screen, the bonfire kindling sound, the sound of a fog gate being pushed through. These details are unverified but beloved as pieces of fan lore regardless of their accuracy, because they paint a picture of a studio that genuinely lives inside the world it makes, a place where the sound of dying in the dark is so familiar it becomes a ringtone, a workplace where everyone has died 1,000 times and considers it a kind of professional credential. Fact 119. Dark Souls fog gates, the shimmering barriers that mark transitions into boss arenas, have a specific audio quality that has become one of gaming's most recognizable sounds. The shimmer, the low resonance, the quality of something being passed through. They appear at every boss encounter and at certain significant doorways, and after enough playtime they produce an almost Pavlovian response, a sharpening of attention, a physical readiness, a held breath. Game designers have noted that the fog gate is one of the most efficient pieces of transition design in the medium because it prepares the player emotionally for what follows without any text or instruction. It is purely somatic communication. Fact 120. The sound of a bonfire, specifically the crackling, the pop of sparks, the subtle warmth it seems to produce even through a screen, has become one of Dark Souls' most culturally significant audio markers. Fan merchandise, ambient playlists, screensavers, countless YouTube videos of bonfires burning with the Firelink theme playing. The bonfire has a life well beyond the game. Bonfire tattoos, bonfire imagery. People describe certain experiences outside of gaming as finding a bonfire, meaning finding a place of rest and safety in something otherwise difficult. The sound of a bonfire in Dark Souls became over the years not just a game mechanic sound, but a cultural shorthand for earned rest, for the specific relief of a breath held too long, finally released. Extended reflection. What the sound teaches you without you knowing the genius of Dark Souls audio design lies in what it teaches your body rather than your mind. Conscious knowledge of a game's mechanics is one thing. The physical anticipation that fires in your chest the moment a fog gate shimmers is another. That reaction is installed over dozens of hours of play, written into your nervous system by repetition and consequence. By the time you've played enough Dark Souls, your heartbeat rises before your mind has time to name what's happening. The fog gate teaches your body about thresholds, about the difference between the world you're prepared for and the world you're about to enter. It's a ritual marker, a moment of transition, the same function a door knocker serves, or a doorbell, or the pause before you cross a significant threshold in any context. Dark Souls found that exact point where architecture and audio and consequence converge to produce meaning in the body, not just the head. This extends to the silence of Lordran. Walking through an area where you know something large and hostile lives, where no music plays and only the ambient sounds of wind or distant water fill the air, your body begins doing the math about where the next threat might come from. The silence isn't peaceful, it's loaded. The game has trained you to read the absence of music as a kind of armed uncertainty, and that reading is correct, because when music comes, it comes with a boss, and the boss always arrives before you feel ready. The entire acoustic world of Dark Souls is a conversation between what you know and what your body knows, and the body's knowledge runs faster and deeper than you might expect from a video game. Section 9, Kindling the Community. Facts 121 through 135. The world of Dark Souls would be significantly less than it is without the community that formed around it. Speedrunners, lore scholars, challenge runners, cooperative players, relentless experimenters, they have added whole dimensions to the games. Fact 121. The speedrunning community for Dark Souls has developed routes that can complete the game in under an hour by optimizing every possible shortcut, skip, and exploit. The current any percent world record sits at around 20 minutes, using a technique called zip glitching that allows the player to move across vast distances instantly by exploiting the game's physics engine. Watching a good Dark Souls speedrun is watching someone move through a world you might have spent 70 hours in, as if it's a corridor of 60 meters. It communicates something interesting about the relationship between mastery and experience. The path you take when you know every inch of the territory is almost nothing like the path you take when you're still learning that the territory exists. Fact: 122. Certain Dark Souls players have completed the game without dying, called no-hit runs, some of whom do so without leveling up, without armor, without using any of the game's upgrade or character-building systems, relying entirely on memorized positioning and perfectly timed dodges. These runs take extraordinary amounts of preparation and typically many attempts over hundreds of hours. They are not primarily about showing the game is easy. They are about what human beings can achieve through sustained, focused learning of a single complex system. They are, in a strange way, one of the most optimistic things the Dark Souls community has produced. Evidence that within a world designed to be difficult, mastery is genuinely possible. Fact 123. The Dark Souls fandom has produced an enormous body of lore analysis and theory. Content creators like Vadavidya on YouTube have built substantial communities around methodical, thorough examinations of item descriptions, environmental details, and character interactions. Videos examining a single item's lore can run to 30 minutes. The effort invested in constructing these analyses, and the audience that watches them, represents a specific kind of engagement with fiction. Not passive consumption, but active archaeology, treating the game's world as a historical record to be excavated. The people who do this work are doing something genuinely close to textual scholarship, building arguments from evidence, testing interpretations against counter-evidence, revising their understanding when new details emerge. Fact 124. The message system in Dark Souls, which allows players to leave notes for others on the ground using a limited set of pre-written words and phrases, has produced one of the internet's longest-running running jokes. The message, "Try jumping," placed at the edge of bottomless pits. The message format only allows certain combinations of words, so players cannot write full sentences, but within those constraints they have found ways to produce poetry, genuine warnings, elaborate metaphors, elaborate trolling, and occasionally things that are somehow both at once. The message system is a creative constraint that produced unexpected literature. Fact 125. From Software's online system, for the first Dark Souls, used dedicated servers that were eventually shut down, making online play unavailable for years on certain platforms. The community developed a mod called Dark Souls Connectivity Mod, known as DSCM, to enable peer-to-peer connections and restore some form of online functionality. When the remastered version launched with new server infrastructure, it effectively gave the game online multiplayer again after its original servers had gone dark. The community spent years keeping the game playable through unofficial means, which is an unusual kind of institutional loyalty. They loved it enough to fix it themselves. Fact 126. A player named Lobos Jr. completed Dark Souls using only his feet, controlling the character through carefully placed foot movements on a controller. A player named Bearsley Bear completed Dark Souls using a steering wheel. Multiple players have completed it using only a microphone for voice commands. Someone completed it using a Guitar Hero controller. The creative and physical range of ways people have found to complete Dark Souls is a testament to both the community's inventiveness and to the underlying quality of the game's design. If the systems are rich enough, people will find 20 different physical interfaces for engaging with them. Fact 127. The Solaire fan theory, which proposed that Solaire of Astora might be Gwyn's forgotten firstborn son, became one of the most debated pieces of fan interpretation in gaming history. The evidence includes Solaire's association with the sun, his arrival at Lordran from outside its borders, his search for his own son, the timing of his appearance relative to the disappearance of Gwyn's firstborn from the historical record, and various subtle item description cross-references. From Software has never confirmed or denied this theory. Miyazaki, in interviews where it has been raised, has been characteristically enigmatic. The theory may be true, may be partially true, or may be entirely the community constructing meaning from coincidence. The beauty of it is that the game doesn't care which is correct. Fact 128. Dark Souls annual challenge seasons appear organically in the community, where players propose and complete self-imposed rule sets for new ways of experiencing the game. No deaths, no armor, no healing, using only fists. These challenges have expanded into organized online events, charity streams, and community competitions. The game's depth supports this. Nearly every challenge run requires different strategies, different knowledge, different prioritizations. The games are not simply hard. They are complex in a way that creates essentially infinite replayability through constraint. Fact 129. Dark Souls' influence on game design is legible in dozens of games that have come after it. Hollow Knight adopted the lost soul retrieval mechanic, the environmental storytelling approach, and the boss fight emphasis. Nioh took the stamina management and build complexity and pushed them in different directions. Sekiro, from Software itself, stripped healing to almost nothing and replaced it with a parry-based rhythm. Elden Ring opened the interconnected world design to an enormous open landscape. The games that cite Dark Souls as an influence are now numerous enough to form their own small genre, and each one reveals a different facet of what made the original work. Not just the difficulty, but the design philosophy behind it. Fact 130. The Twitch Plays Dark Souls experiment, a variation on the famous Twitch Plays Pokemon social experiment, took place and produced a genuinely different experience from its predecessor. Where Pokemon's simple turn-based combat could eventually be navigated by mass crowd input, Dark Souls' real-time action combat made the experiment significantly more chaotic and, in certain moments, significantly more emotionally affecting. Watching thousands of inputs simultaneously try to guide a character through Blight Town or against a boss is a specific kind of absurdist performance art that the game's design facilitated by accident, simply by being what it is. Fact 131. Lance McDonald, an independent game researcher and developer, has contributed enormously to public knowledge of cut content across From Software's games. His investigations into Dark Souls 3's files revealed the original final boss placement, the planned day and night cycle, and numerous other cut elements. His research into Bloodborne, conducted through particularly difficult means given that game's console exclusivity, revealed cut areas, bosses, and NPCs. He does this work partly as a professional interest in game development and partly out of genuine love for these games and curiosity about what they might have been. He represents a form of fan engagement that is genuinely scholarship, requiring technical skill, patience, and the same spirit of obsessive investigation that the games themselves reward. Fact 132. The Prepare to Die edition of Dark Souls, released on PC in 2012, was the first time a significant portion of the Western PC gaming audience encountered the series. Prior to this, it had been a console game with a passionate but smaller than mainstream following. The PC release opened it to the modding community, the speedrunning community, and the broader gaming press and content creator economy. The game's exposure grew exponentially. This is the moment, arguably, when Dark Souls stopped being a cult game and started becoming a genre-defining cultural landmark. The Prepare to Die title was originally criticized as aggressive marketing. In retrospect, it just named the experience honestly. Fact 133. From Software has 423 employees as of June 2024. For a studio that has made some of the most commercially successful and critically acclaimed games of the last decade and a half, with Elden Ring alone selling over 25 million copies, that is a remarkably small number. Most AAA game studios employ thousands of people. From Software's workforce is closer to a large indie studio than a traditional publisher-backed blockbuster developer. This means that everything they make is made with significant constraint, which may be part of why the creativity within those constraints is so consistent. Scarcity of resources has historically been a reliable driver of creative solutions. Fact 134. In October 2024, From Software announced a salary increase of approximately 12% for employees. Following a report from late 2022 that the studio was paying at below standard industry rates. The games they make generate enormous revenue. The conversation about what developers are paid for making those games is ongoing across the industry, and From Software's announcement was received as a positive step in an environment where many game developers feel undercompensated for their contribution to an industry generating billions of dollars annually. The people who built Lordran, who composed those boss themes, who designed those bonfires, deserve to be compensated in proportion to what they gave the world. Fact 135. In April 2025, From Software announced The Duskbloods, a multiplayer-focused Souls-like directed by Miyazaki himself for the Nintendo Switch 2. This represents a significant departure from the studio's recent trend toward massive single-player open-world experiences and suggests that Miyazaki is interested in exploring what the community-centric, asynchronous multiplayer philosophy that began with the message system and summoning signs in the first Dark Souls can become in a format designed specifically around shared, social play. The game was announced with limited details, but its existence suggests that the conversation between From Software and its community that has been ongoing since 2009 is far from over. Interlude: Across the Ages. The wider universe of Souls before the final facts and the closing reflection. Let's spend some time in the corners of the trilogy that often get less attention, and in the broader From Software universe that the Dark Souls series helped create. Dark Souls 2 is set in a land called Drangleic, separated from Lordran by an enormous span of time. The world has cycled, the fire was linked, it faded, a new age emerged, that age built its own civilization, that civilization decayed. Drangleic is Lordran's grandchild, several generations removed, carrying echoes of the same cosmological problems, but in different cultural packaging. The kingdom is ruled by King Vendrick, who waged a war against the giants from across the sea. He was betrayed by his queen, Nashandra, who is later revealed to be a fragment of the soul of Manus, the first human consumed by the abyss. She sought the power of the first flame not to sustain it, but to claim it. Vendrick, realizing too late what she was, fled to an underground cave and hollowed himself, rather than give her access to his great soul. When you encounter him in the game, he is enormous, hollow, endlessly circling in a dark cave, stripped of everything but the mechanical persistence of his legs. He is one of the most haunting visual images in the series, a great king reduced to ambulatory ruin, moving because that's all that's left to do. Dark Souls 2's throne is the most explicitly articulated seat of power in the series. The entire game builds toward the question of who will sit on it and what that means. The throne represents the power to link the fire or to let it fade, the same essential choice as the endings of the first game. But where Dark Souls 1 presented this choice without context or editorial comment, Dark Souls 2 has characters who articulate the philosophical stakes explicitly. The Emerald Herald, your primary guide through the game, wants you to surpass the cycle rather than simply participate in it. Her wish is that someone will finally be strong enough to transcend the choice rather than make it. This thread, begun in Dark Souls 2, is what Dark Souls 3's entire lore eventually addresses. The cycle has been running too long, and the question of whether it can be stopped rather than continued is finally answered, or at least seriously engaged. Aldea, scholar of the First Sin, is Dark Souls 2's most significant philosophical figure, and the one most concerned with whether the cycle is inevitable. Aldea was Vendrick's brother, and conducted experiments on giants and dragons, trying to find a way to transcend the undead curse. He became something monstrous in the process, a creature of twisted roots and ancient fire, haunting his manor. But his intellectual ambition survived the physical ruin, and in conversations with him throughout the game's DLC, he argues that the cycle persists because no one has ever genuinely chosen a different path, only variations on the same two paths. He offers the possibility of a third option, not linking the fire or letting it fade, but walking away from the entire framework. His argument is never fully resolved, which is very Dark Souls. The question is asked, the possibilities are laid out, and the answer is left to you. The Crown DLC trilogy for Dark Souls 2 builds a specific thematic structure across 3 connected expansions. Each expansion rewards you with a crown, and bringing all 3 crowns to the hallowed Vendrick causes him to briefly speak again with lucidity, his preserved consciousness recognizing what you've gathered. He acknowledges his mistake, his queen, his failure, his love, the whole weight of it in a few sentences, and then he returns to silence. He can't undo anything. He can only finally say out loud what he knows. That's the only gift the game offers him, and, through him, you. The chance to hear a tragedy named by the one who lived it. Moving briefly to Sekiro, shadows die twice, which is not Dark Souls, but is profoundly of the same creative family. The game's resurrection mechanic, in which the main character Wolf can revive from death a limited number of times before consequences escalate, is the most direct engagement with the Dark Souls death loop as narrative in the studio's history. Sekiro doesn't pretend the resurrection is mechanical. It is lore. Wolf came back wrong. He's sharing his resurrection with a child who shouldn't have to bear it. The deaths and revivals have consequences for the people around him, not just for the game's difficulty. This is the direction that the Souls death philosophy points when you follow it to its logical narrative endpoint. Eventually, someone asks why this person keeps getting back up, and the answer has a human cost. Sekiro's posture system, which governs how combat is won not through depleting health, but through breaking an enemy's composure and guard, is one of the most precise mechanical representations of what combat feels like psychologically. You are not trying to hurt your enemy. You are trying to break their certainty, their belief that they can withstand you. The game is a series of conversations in the language of swords, and the goal is not damage, but destabilization. It is perhaps the most sophisticated mechanical argument From Software has ever made about the nature of conflict. And it emerged directly from everything the Souls games had been exploring about the relationship between challenge, learning, and what it feels like to finally find the crack in a previously impassable defense. None of these games are islands. They are parts of the same sustained inquiry. What does it feel like to be in a world that does not arrange itself for your convenience? What does earned progress feel like? What does loss mean when it has consequences? What do fire and darkness and loyalty and the slow erosion of meaning and the occasional unexpected kindness of a stranger add up to over the course of a lifetime of playing them? Something substantial, something that outlasts the fire. Section 10. The Flame That Never Quite Goes Out. Facts 136 through 150. We're nearly there. 15 more facts, settling around you like embers before the last bonfire. Let the weight of these sink slowly, one by one. The philosophy of the bonfire, what Dark Souls is really about. Step back from the facts for a moment and consider the shape of the whole. Dark Souls is a game built around a single, repeating image, the bonfire. A small fire in a large dark. You find it after effort. You rest beside it. You gather what you've lost. You move on again into the dark that surrounds it on all sides. Every other game element in the series radiates outward from that central image. The cost of the journey, the necessity of rest, the way the dark doesn't go away when you sit beside the light. You can't extinguish the dark. You can only have this fire, for now, and move through what surrounds it as carefully as you can. Miyazaki has described his earliest experiences of reading as similar, finding small pockets of understanding in texts too large for him to fully comprehend, resting in the parts he understood while the rest remained obscure. The bonfire is a reading experience. You find the parts of the world you can navigate. You understand what you can understand. The rest continues to surround you, large and full of things you haven't named yet. But the fire is here, and you are warm for a moment, and that is enough to keep going. That's the philosophy that tens of millions of people encountered, often without being able to articulate it when they played these games. The world is difficult, and the dark doesn't end. But warmth is possible, earned warmth. Warmth that means something, because you walked through the cold to get to it. The bonfire always means you made it here. The bonfire always says, you can rest now. And that sentence, in a difficult world, is one of the most generous things any piece of art can say. And with that, let the last few facts fall gently around you like ash from a distant fire. 11 more, and then we close. The phrase "praise the sun," associated with Solaire and his iconic arms-raised gesture, has become one of gaming's most recognizable cultural symbols. It appears on t-shirts, tattoos, car decals, and in countless social media contexts as a gesture of enthusiastic positivity or ironic joy. Solaire himself, in his cheerful, uncomplicated devotion to the sun, represents something the broader culture found genuinely moving in a game famous for bleak nihilism, a character who remains hopeful without being naive, devoted without being delusional, warm in a cold world. The gesture has a specific visual weight, arms thrown wide toward the light, that communicates something beyond the game it came from. That's a level of cultural penetration very few gaming moments achieve. Fact 137. The term Soulsborne was coined by the fan community to group From Software's interconnected catalog of Demon Souls, the Dark Souls trilogy, and Bloodborne, all of which share design philosophies if not narrative continuity. Later, Sekiro and Elden Ring joined the informal family, and the broader term Souls-like emerged to cover games by other developers that adopted elements of the formula. This is significant. A set of design choices has become legible enough, distinctive enough, and influential enough to name a genre. That doesn't happen with many individual games. Usually genres are named after the first game to do something broadly. Dark Souls named a genre not by being first, but by being definitive. Fact 138. The first Dark Souls was cited as an influence in an interview for the Netflix series Stranger Things. The showrunners noted that the show's aesthetic of mystery, hidden lore, and revealed horror had something in common with how Dark Souls approached its world building. Whether or not this was a direct influence or a shared sensibility, the crossover between Dark Souls as a cultural text and the broader cultural conversation about storytelling is telling. Games like this change how people think about how stories can be told. Fact 139. The PlayStation Network's trophy system, specifically the design of asynchronous social features, has been cited in developer documentation and interviews as influenced by the online systems first popularized in Demon Souls and Dark Souls. The ability to see what other players are doing, to be aware of others without directly interacting with them, to feel a communal presence in an essentially solitary experience. These were central to the Souls design and became central to how PSN thought about social gaming features. A game about loneliness, designed around the occasional presence of anonymous strangers, informed how a major platform thought about community. Fact 140. The Dark Souls trilogy's complete arc, from the first game to Dark Souls 3 and its DLCs, tells a coherent story about a cosmological cycle that has been running too long. The Age of Fire began when Gwyn and the other lords defeated the dragons. It was extended by Gwyn's sacrifice at the kiln. It was extended again and again by successive chosen undead who linked the flame. By Dark Souls 3, the world is so depleted from repeated kindling that it is literally ashen and gray. The Firelink Shrine is the cemetery of ash. The gods are all dead or mad or gone. Every grand location you walk through in the first game is a ruin in the third. The series is not three separate stories. It is one long story about what happens when something refuses to end. Fact 141. The furtive pygmy, mentioned in the opening creation myth of Dark Souls as the one who found the Dark Soul, is so easily forgotten. This description, applied to the ancestor of humanity in a game ostensibly about an undead human's journey to determine the fate of the world, reads as a kind of cosmic irony. Humanity's great ancestor is the one who gets overlooked, the smallest soul, the darkest soul, the one who stayed quiet while Nito and the witch and Gwyn did spectacular things with their lord's souls. And yet the furtive pygmy's dark soul is the one that persisted, the one that scattered into countless humans, the one that outlasted the Age of Fire and will exist when the Age of Dark begins. The one who was forgotten became the foundation of everything. Fact 142. The ending of the first Dark Souls is genuinely ambiguous in a way that becomes more rather than less interesting over time. If you link the fire, you extend the Age of Fire temporarily and walk into the flame. If you walk away, the Age of Dark begins. The game presents both options without editorializing. Frampt approves of linking. Kaothi approves of walking away. Neither gives you the full story of what either ending means for the people living in Lordran. You simply choose, and the game ends. And the question of which was right is not answered by anything in the game itself, only by how you've come to understand the world through the hours you spent inside it. It's an ending that requires you to have paid attention to everything. Fact 143. Elden Ring, the culmination of everything Miyazaki and From Software built through the Souls games, is the highest-selling game in the studio's history and one of the highest-rated games ever made. It sold 12 million copies in its first 2 weeks, a record for From Software at the time, and later passed 25 million copies total. The critical reception included numerous Game of the Year awards for 2022, and it appeared on essentially every major greatest games ever made list within a year of its release. Elden Ring represents the Souls design philosophy applied to an open world of enormous scale, written in collaboration with George R.R. Martin, who contributed the world-building history of the Lands Between. This collaboration produced something unusual in game development, an open world that felt genuinely ancient, where every ruin was a ruin of something specific, where every legacy dungeon was a monument to a specific fall. The scale of Elden Ring is what makes it different from its predecessors, but the philosophy, the respect for the player's capacity, the silence that invites interpretation, the fire that you find after effort, all of that came directly from the games we've been exploring tonight. The game that nobody wanted to fund in 2009, that sold under expectations at launch, eventually built a studio that could make one of the biggest games in the world and fill it with everything the studio had learned across a decade and a half of making people die in the dark and come back again. Fact 144. Miyazaki has spoken in interviews about his belief that difficulty in games is not an end in itself, but a means of creating meaningful emotional experiences. The difficulty of Dark Souls is not a wall to keep people out. It's a system for generating the specific emotional texture of earned progress, the sharpness of genuine risk, the weight of death as a consequence rather than an inconvenience. When things are easy, overcoming them produces little. When things are hard, overcoming them produces something real. This philosophy, applied with care, is what separates Dark Souls' difficulty from arbitrary cruelty. The game is hard because Miyazaki wants you to feel something. That's a design philosophy with a clear human center. Fact 145. The item descriptions in all 3 Dark Souls games have been translated, retranslated, and analyzed for word choice, grammatical nuance, and the gap between Japanese original and English localization. Some significant lore details exist in the Japanese original that English translators rendered differently, producing distinct interpretations of the same item's history. Communities of fans who read Japanese have provided fan translations of specific items and compared them to official localization choices, opening debates about which version of a given fact is canonical. The games were designed to be interpreted. Even the translation of them requires interpretation. Fact 146. The Dark Souls series, as of 2025, has shipped over 39 million copies worldwide, not counting Demon's Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, or Elden Ring. If you include those games, the total scope of what Miyazaki's design philosophy has produced, commercially and culturally, represents one of the most significant creative achievements in the medium's history. A game that started as a failure nobody wanted has, over 15 years, become a sustained artistic vision that touches millions of people and genuinely changed how an industry thinks about what games can be. The Dark Souls series, as of 2025, has shipped over 39 million copies worldwide, not counting Demon's Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, or Elden Ring. If you include those games and the entirety of what Miyazaki's design philosophy has produced, we are talking about a commercial and cultural footprint that rivals the most successful gaming franchises of the last century. A game that started as a failure nobody wanted has, over 15 years, become a sustained artistic vision that touches millions of people and genuinely changed how an entire industry thinks about what games can be and what they can ask of the people who play them. The trajectory of that story, from insurance money company origins to motorcycle accidents and borrowed manga, from a failing project nobody cared about to a genre-defining legacy, is genuinely one of the most improbable success stories in the history of commercial art. Fact 147. The bonfires of Dark Souls, as a piece of design, have been discussed and analyzed in game design literature as one of the most elegant checkpoint systems ever made. They do multiple things simultaneously. They serve as save points, as respawn locations, as the primary hub for character upgrades, as points of rest and reflection in the narrative, and as the game's central metaphor for hope and warmth in an otherwise cold world. The bonfire is a design object of such multifunctional economy that game designers in other studios have cited it as an example of how a single mechanic, done well, can carry the emotional weight of an entire game. But beyond the design literature and the mechanical analysis, what the bonfire actually does for people is simpler and harder to name. It gives you somewhere to go when you're lost. In a world without minimap, without quest markers, without a floating arrow telling you which direction to walk, the bonfire is the one fixed, reliable point. It is always where you left it. It is always warm. You can always go back. That reliability, in a world designed to take things away from you, is the most profound gift the games offer, and it costs nothing, and it means everything. Fact 148. In the Ringed City DLC, there is a scene late in the expansion where you are fighting through a swamp and an enormous angel, a creature of divine light and enormous wings, is pursuing you. It fires beams of light that track slowly and cover enormous distances. The swamp is full of enemies. The solution requires finding a corpse that, when you interact with it, renders you invisible to the angel. The creature of divine light cannot find you when you hold the dead. That image, that specific mechanic communicating that specific thing, divinity cannot see you when you are holding death. That's Dark Souls at its most compressed and precise. A single interaction that contains a philosophy. Fact 149. Miyazaki has expressed the hope that his games are experienced as acts of mutual creation between the developer and the player. He provides a world, a set of systems, a collection of fragments. The player brings their imagination, their interpretation, their patience, their failures, and assembles from all of those things a personal experience that is partly design and partly the player's own mind. In his view, the gaps in the storytelling are not deficiencies, they are invitations. The dark corners of Lordran are spaces he deliberately left for you to fill with your own ideas about what might have happened here, who might have lived here, what this crumbling thing once was. The game is finished by each person who plays it. It is a collaboration between a designer and a stranger, mediated by architecture and silence. Fact 150. The first flame will fade. It always does. Every age of fire has an end, and what comes after is not destruction but change. The age of dark, the age of humanity, the world as it naturally wants to be. All of the tragedy in Dark Souls, the corrupted gods, the hollow knights, the flooded cities and burned districts, stems from the refusal to accept this. Gwyn was afraid of what came after the fire, and everything he did to prevent it caused more suffering than the darkness he feared. The lesson, woven through every item description and every fallen kingdom, is patient and consistent. The things you hold too tightly are the things that destroy you, and the fire you refuse to let go burns everything in its light, including you. Rest. You found the bonfire. Extended closing on what endures. Let's linger here a little longer, in this space between facts and sleep, and talk about what the Dark Souls series leaves behind that isn't about mechanics or lore or speedrun routes or the number of copies sold. Dark Souls is one of the few pieces of mainstream entertainment in the last 20 years that argued, with complete seriousness, that difficulty is a form of respect. That hardship experienced in fiction can produce genuine emotional growth. That the player's intelligence, patience, and willingness to fail repeatedly deserves to be taken seriously by the thing they're engaging with. That is a remarkable argument to make with a video game, and the fact that tens of millions of people responded to it suggests that a great many people felt, perhaps not consciously, that they had been underestimated by the entertainment they were being offered. Every time you die in Dark Souls and the red letters appear and you have to try again, the game is saying, you can do better. Not in a punitive way, in the way of a teacher who knows what you're capable of, who has arranged the world to develop that capability, and who will wait patiently at whatever interval is required for you to find the approach that works. This is not how most games work. Most games exist to provide an experience that flows smoothly. Dark Souls exists to develop something in the person playing it. Whether that something is patience, pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, or simply the capacity to sit with failure and keep moving, the game treats the player as someone who has those capabilities even when the player doubts it themselves. There are players who have written about Dark Souls the way they might write about something that helped them through a difficult period in their lives. Not because the game solved any real problem, but because working through it taught them something about their own relationship with difficulty, about sitting with something hard and not walking away, about the way small victories feel different when they're earned against real resistance. This is a strange thing to attribute to a game, but it is attributed genuinely by enough people and with enough specificity of detail that it seems worth taking seriously. The game found something real and pressed on it in a way that left a mark. The bonfire is always the same bonfire. Every time you return to it, it's there. The fire might be lower. The enemies that threatened you might have respawned, but the fire is always there, and you can always rest beside it. And that consistency, that reliable warmth in an unreliable world, is a design choice that communicates something the designers perhaps didn't consciously intend, but produced nonetheless. Stability is possible, rest is achievable. You might have to fight your way to it, and you might have to fight your way to it again tomorrow, but the fire waits. The series has inspired music, visual art, fan fiction, cosplay, speedrunning, lore analysis, community organizing, charity streaming, and millions of conversations between strangers who recognized in each other the specific experience of having walked through Lordran and emerged with something they couldn't fully name. That's a cultural impact that goes beyond entertainment. It's a shared language, a common reference point, a thing that happened to a lot of people, quietly, in their own rooms, in front of their own screens, that they then carried out into the world and found, with some surprise, that others were carrying the same thing. Dark Souls taught a generation of players that they were capable of more than they thought, not through encouragement or affirmation, but through the oldest method. It put something genuinely difficult in front of them and waited to see what they would do. And they did remarkable things. They kept going. They figured it out. They helped strangers in worlds they'd never see again. They left messages in chalk on floors made of code for people they'd never meet, saying, "Be wary of edge," or "Try jumping," or, more carefully, more honestly, pressed onto a stone floor in a dying kingdom, "There's a bonfire ahead." There is always a bonfire ahead. Sleep well, good hunter. The bonfire never truly goes out. What you carry out of these games is your own. There's no single correct reading of Lordran, no canonical interpretation of Gwyn's tragedy, or Solaire's son, or Sif's grief that supersedes your personal experience of encountering them. The lore scholars and the speedrunners and the challenge runners and the players who spent 40 hours in Blighttown before finally finding the way forward, each of them has a Lordran that is slightly different, shaped by the specific order of their discoveries and the specific way the difficulty pressed against their particular skill and patience. Miyazaki left room for all of them. He built a world that is large enough to mean different things to different people, consistent enough that none of those meanings is arbitrary, and resonant enough that the meanings people find tend to matter to them in ways that outlast the playthrough that generated them. The fire in the first bonfire at Firelink Shrine will always look the same. The sound it makes will always be the same. And every person who ever rested beside it, weary from whatever they had just survived, is part of the same enormous, unlikely community of people who went somewhere difficult and found, at the center of the difficulty, a small fire, and sat down beside it and decided to keep going. That's enough. That will always be enough. Good night. And if you enjoyed this journey and want to support more long-form explorations like this one, please leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with anyone else who might want something slow and thoughtful to drift to sleep beside. Your support is what keeps the bonfire going. See you next time. 150 facts about one of the most extraordinary worlds ever made, spoken slowly into the dark for anyone willing to listen. If you made it here still awake, I genuinely hope you enjoyed the journey through Lordran and beyond. If you drifted somewhere along the way, I hope the facts stitch themselves into whatever dreams you found. If you have a favorite Dark Souls fact, a theory you love, a moment from the game that you will never forget, I want to hear it in the comments. And if this kind of slow deep dive into the games you love is what you want more of, please consider subscribing. It means everything, and it's the most direct way to say, keep going, keep the fire going. Good night, good hunter. The bonfire never truly goes out.